Chapter 559. It felt like 1,000 years, but it also felt like a blink of an eye. In the darkness of the abyss, Aisha walked forward aimlessly. There was no thought in her mind. She was like a walking corpse, until a burning sensation burned her whole body. She felt a burning pain. Her mind was numb. Suddenly, a bit of consciousness appeared in her numb mind. In the silent darkness of the ice cave, Aisha's eyelashes trembled slightly. She slowly woke up. She gently opened her eyes and saw the darkness. Her consciousness followed the source of the burning pain. She subconsciously raised her hand to touch her abdomen. She was very familiar with this burning feeling. It was hunger. The acid in her stomach seemed to be tumbling, stirring the stomach wall violently. At the same time, her body felt like it was being swallowed by her abdomen. She felt that if she continued, her stomach would digest all the internal organs in her abdomen. She struggled to support herself. Suddenly, her palm touched a cluster of cold and sharp things. She couldn't help but turn her head to look. Suddenly, her pupils shrank. She saw a black-haired figure lying on the ice block in her hand. It was the previous dean. At this moment, the latter's body was shrouded with a cold air. There was a faint layer of thin ice on his armor. The place she touched before was Dean's hair. The soft black hair had long been frozen as hard as steel needles. "I'm not dead." Aisha was startled, and the memory before the coma instantly flooded into her brain. Her face changed slightly, and she hurriedly reached out to support Dean. As soon as she touched him, her fingertips instinctively retracted, as if she was bitten by a poisonous snake. There was a kind of tingling feeling which surprised her a little. Even ice cubes couldn't make her feel so cold. Could it be that Dean's body temperature was lower than ice? Although she didn't have any education, years of fighting in various environments made her understand that if the water temperature was lower than ice, it would freeze. That was to say, the blood in Dean's body had frozen. If the blood was frozen, could a person still live? Thinking of this, her face was a little pale. She hurriedly reached out to touch Dean's carotid artery. This was the place that could best reflect the state of suspended animation. However, Dean's carotid artery did not beat. Dead? Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the youth in a daze. Very quickly, the cold air that invaded her caused her to return to her senses. She couldn't help but raise her head to look around and was immediately stunned. This place was actually a sealed barrier made of ice. She was surprised and even a bit at a loss. In her mind, even the coldest day of the black snow season wouldn't condense so much ice. Black snow couldn't be kneaded into ice. Only the monastery's cultivators could borrow the power of nature to fight with ice, fire, wind, and thunder. The shape of the ice barrier had strong traces of manual production. It was obvious that it was built by Dean. Could it be that he was a monk from a monastery? She stared blankly for a while. Suddenly, she saw a 7 to 8 meter long heat source in the darkness in front of her. It looked like it was swimming in the air. Her gaze immediately fell on the frozen water in front of her. In an instant, she immediately understood what had happened before she fainted. She also knew why there was a sealed barrier made of ice here. All of this was to prevent the smell of her blood from spreading. She turned her head to look at the frozen Dean next to her. Her expression was a bit complicated, and she slightly clenched her fingers. Crack! Suddenly, there was a cracking sound in the silence. Aisha was shocked. Her first reaction was to look at the frozen water, but soon she saw that there was no monster attacking under the water. At this time, the cracking sound rang again. She suddenly turned back and looked at the source of the sound, Dean's left shoulder. She was slightly startled and quickly pulled off the shoulder pad on Dean's left shoulder. Suddenly, her pupils shrank, and her eyes revealed a bit of horror. Dean's left hand was completely frozen. Unlike the transparent ice, it was pure white. In this snow-white arm, she could see blue lines, which were the meridians and blood vessels in Dean's arm. The cracking sound came from Dean's arm. The cold condensed and slowly grew into ice-like spikes, which were caused by the spikes poking into the shoulder pad. Ice freezing disease. Aisha took a light breath. She was a little shocked. She didn't expect Dean to suffer from this terrible and incurable disease. Moreover, it was a legendary taboo disease. With freezing disease, he is more sensitive to temperature changes. He is most afraid of cold. For ordinary people, the temperature drops by 1 or 2 degrees, but for him, it is as cold as dropping by 20 degrees. Aisha's lips trembled slightly, and a trace of mist gushed out of her eyes. She slightly covered her mouth, and there was an impulse to cry. She could resist the temperature inside the barrier made of ice, but for Dean, even if his physique was doubled, he still couldn't resist it. Nevertheless, the boy still chose this most disadvantageous method to fight for a glimmer of life for her. Why? Why did you try so hard to save me? Aisha's eyes were a little wet, and she only felt a pain in her chest. Another person who was close to her was implicated by her. Even if there was no mischief in the middle, the ending was still like this. Why? She clenched her legs and clenched her teeth. After a long time, the sadness in her heart gradually faded, and then she thought of the injuries on her body. The corners of her mouth twitched slightly, and she suddenly felt a trace of fatigue and sadness. No matter how great the sadness was, it seemed that it would eventually pass, be forgotten, or be endured, then continue to live. The torn wounds healed day after day in endurance, until they were forgotten. This seemed to be the innate talent of life. Tenacious, cruel. She silently reached out and touched her back. She felt that the wound was cold, and it seemed to have healed. She looked at the ice bed beneath her and suddenly understood. In this low temperature, the poison in her body had permeated more slowly. During this slow permeation, her body's immune system had gradually adapted and improved while resisting for a long time. That was why she had been able to wake up. The role of this ice barrier was not simply to block the smell of her blood, but to inhibit the spread of the toxin in her body. It could be said to be killing 2 birds with 1 stone. However, it was not easy to think of such a method. Even if he thought of it, it may not be implemented in such a desolate world outside the giant wall. She didn't need to think to know that Dean must have painstakingly spent a lot of energy to do this. Chapter 560. Aisha felt sour in her heart. She stretched out her hand and pressed Dean's legs and hands straight, keeping him in a lying position. She decided to keep this ice cave. After her injury was completely healed, she would come back here and bring Dean's body back to the wall to be buried. Looking at the thin frost covering Dean's body, she knew that it would not melt in a short time. This could also keep Dean's body frozen and avoid decay. She took a deep look at him from his eyebrows to his nose to his lips and then to his body. She wanted to remember this boy. From childhood to adulthood, except for the servants, he was the first person who was willing to die for her. When she saw Dean's chest, she was slightly startled. Her eyes that were blurred by the fog could not help but narrow a little. The world in her sight instantly became colorful. Her eyes penetrated into Dean's chest armor and suddenly saw a red heat source, slightly expanding and beating. It was his heart. She was stunned. Not dead. He was not dead. Aisha's eyes widened slightly, and the size of her pupils suddenly returned. She saw that the frost armor on Dean's chest was gently beating in an extremely weak range, and the white frost mist on the armor was also slightly fluctuating. This clear scene made her startled. The next moment, she felt that the blood in her body was boiling, and a huge surprise and excitement gushed out. She quickly squatted beside Dean and pressed her hand on his chest. Suddenly, she felt the surging beat, extremely powerful. This was not the heartbeat of a dying person, but more like a strong heartbeat after a strenuous exercise. The beating was so large that the armor on his body was undulating. She was a little surprised. Previously, Dean was lying on his stomach, so she didn't notice it. What she didn't expect was that the carotid artery was not beating, but the heart was still beating so strongly. This was simply against her common sense. However, since the heart was beating, it could prove that Dean was still alive. She immediately picked up Dean's body and put him on the ground next to her. The frozen disease was most afraid of cold. Previously, she thought that Dean was dead, so she put his body on the ice for storage. Naturally, she could not let him continue to lie on the ice. Otherwise, he would be completely frozen to death, even if he did not die. After Dean was lying on the ground, she pushed the ice bed to the other side, as far away as possible. Then she rubbed her hands to let her palms heat up as soon as possible. After the palms were hot, she immediately reached out and pressed on Dean's heart, letting his heart drive the blood flow of the whole body to restore his body temperature as soon as possible. Her warm palms were pressed against Dean's chest, but it didn't take long for them to feel cold. She immediately lifted her palms, continued to knead, and then pressed them against his chest again. After several hours of continuous movements, her physical strength was finally exhausted, and the wound on her back was also a little painful. Only then did she remember that she woke up because she was hungry, which meant that she had been in a coma for a period of time, maybe a few days. After all, the food in her stomach would not be so easily starved to this extent. Her eyes swept around and suddenly saw a pile of things on the ground. There was a white crystal stone. She recognized it as saltpeter. Next to it were some high-temperature compressed food ingredients. She immediately opened 2 bags and stuffed them into her mouth. While chewing and swallowing, she rubbed her hands together and returned to Dean. She rubbed her palms together and continued to press them on his body. Under continuous efforts, the frost on Dean's chest had subsided. Her hands touched Dean's forehead and cheeks. The head was the most critical place besides the heart. Dean would wake up only when the temperature of the head was restored. Her white hands rubbed back and forth on Dean's cheeks. Unlike his beating heart, the temperature on Dean's cheeks was extremely low. It was cold to the touch, far colder than ice. Although ice was already the coldest thing in her concept. Under continuous rubbing, the frost on Dean's face was removed, but his skin was still hard and extremely cold. From time to time, she raised her hands to breathe, tried to raise the temperature of her palms, but as soon as her palms touched Dean's face, her palms instantly became cold as if they had turned into a block of ice. She suddenly thought of a way to melt the ice. Undoubtedly, the way to melt the ice was to heat it up, but if she could not heat it up, watering it with water would also melt the ice quickly. At least the effect would be better than her current rubbing. She could not help but look back at the frozen water. With her thermal vision, she suddenly saw a 7 or 8 meter long heat source swimming not far away. It should be an underwater monster. Once the ice is broken, it will be alarmed. I have to find a way to kill it first. Aisha's eyes flickered slightly. In her current state, it would be a little difficult to kill this monster underwater, but it was not impossible. What worried her was that once she went into the water, the wound would be infected by the water. If the wound was torn again and blood flowed out, she did not know what other monsters would be attracted. At that time, it would be even more difficult to deal with. Her eyes turned, and suddenly she thought of something. Her eyes brightened. She opened her waist bag and took out a small bottle. She poured out a dark red pill, put it in her mouth, chewed it gently, and spat it out after chewing it. She gently opened Dean's mouth, poured the broken pill in her palm into Dean's mouth, and then stroked his throat to help him swallow it. After a while, she opened Dean's mouth again, only to see that the pill was still in his mouth, and it was frozen together. She was startled and a little distressed. If Dean could not swallow the pill, her method could not be implemented. Seeing the frost slowly seeping out of Dean's face, she knew that she could not continue to delay. She took out another bottle from her waist bag. This was a bottle of poison powder. The pill that Dean had taken before was a special antidote for this poison. She was going to sprinkle the poison powder into the water and soak Dean in it. In this way, the monster would be afraid of the poison powder and would not dare to approach. But at present, this method obviously would not work. She picked up the dagger on the ground and came to the frozen water. She gently cut a hole with the dagger, opened the bottle, and sprinkled the poison powder. The underwater monster heard the sound of the ice being cut and immediately swam over quickly. In the blink of an eye, it appeared 50 meters away. At this time, the poison powder fell into the water and immediately drifted away with the surge of the water. The underwater monster did not feel anything and still swam quickly. Seeing this, Aisha held the dagger and lurked next to the ice. Whoosh! The underwater monster came under the ice in the blink of an eye, and its ferocious body swept under the ice. It suddenly turned around in the water, turned back, and raised its head to hit the ice. A cold light flashed in Aisha's eyes. She fearlessly raised the dagger and stabbed at the head of the monster that hit the ice. Puff! The dagger instantly penetrated the monster's head. The ice was broken at the same time. Aisha did not care about affecting the injury. Her arm suddenly exerted force, and the dagger quickly pulled out and then quickly stabbed again. In less than half a second, she stabbed 3 times in a row, each time to a different position, forming a triangular wound. When the last knife stabbed, she shook her wrist and suddenly pried it up. With a click, the flesh in the middle of the triangular wound suddenly flew up. Roar! The hideous mouth of the underwater monster issued a painful roar. Its body suddenly twisted, wanting to shrink back into the water. Aisha's arms suddenly straightened, and the dagger slashed from bottom to top. With the strength of the body of the underwater monster that shrank down, blood instantly bloomed and splashed on the broken ice. The monster shrank back into the water, splashing a meter-high wave on the surface of the water. A lot of blood quickly gushed out from the water, dyeing the water red. After a while, the head of the underwater monster emerged from the water again, soaking in the bright red water. The cuticle on the top of its head was incomparably dark, like a piece of withered bark. Chapter 561. Aisha raised her foot and gently stepped on its head, pushing it forward so that its body would not stop here and attract other monsters. After dealing with the monster, she turned back to the ice cave and looked at Dean, who was frozen on the ground. She was in a dilemma. Although she had killed the monster, there was poison powder in the water, and she had to take an antidote pill to enter the water. The reason why she could kill the underwater monster so easily was that the poison powder had penetrated into its wounds and poisoned it. She paced back and forth. Suddenly, she had an idea. She went to the edge of the water and washed the dagger. Then, she took an antidote and went to the ice bed next to her. She used the dagger to cut off a few thin pieces of ice. She put it in her mouth, and soon the ice melted into water. She continued to hold it in her mouth. When the ice water turned warm, she came to Dean and opened his mouth. She spat the warm water into her hand and sent it into Dean's mouth. Immediately, the frozen fragments of the pill in his mouth were contained and quickly melted. She pushed Dean's jaw to keep opening and closing to relieve his stiff muscles. Soon, the water carried some of the broken pills into Dean's throat. Seeing that it was effective, she immediately stuffed another piece of ice into her mouth. The ice melted quickly, but she felt that her mouth was numb from a cold. After a while, when the ice melted, she continued to spit it into her palm and sent it into Dean's mouth. They repeated the process like 2 fish trapped on the shore, helping each other. More than 10 minutes later, Dean finally swallowed most of the pills in his mouth under the continuous supply of warm water from Aisha. Seeing that it was almost time, Aisha raised her hand to pick up Dean's body and walked to the water. She was so tired that her head was full of hot sweat. In this cold environment, the sweat quickly cooled down and stuck to her forehead. The cold invaded her body, and she felt dizzy. Gritting her teeth, she put Dean's body smoothly into the water. At this moment, the color of the melted blood in the water was a lot lighter. The body of the underwater monster was also pushed by the current and floated dozens of meters away. When Dean's body entered the water, the frost on the surface of his body quickly subsided. The water in the drainage channel was insulated by the soil, so it was warm to the touch. Although it was an illusion caused by the difference in air temperature, the water temperature was about 10 degrees. At this moment, Dean's body was wrapped in the water, and the water near his body quickly cooled down. Aisha squatted by the water, holding Dean's head with both hands and lifting his chin to prevent the dirty blood from flowing into his mouth. She gently swung Dean with the strength of the current, making the water ripple. The warm water repeatedly washed Dean's body in the ripples. This soaking lasted for half an hour. Through her hands holding Dean's head, Aisha could feel that the coldness of his body was gradually decreasing, and his body temperature was gradually recovering. In her thermal vision, she could also see the heat source emitted from Dean's body. Although it was weak, it was gradually becoming stronger. When she felt that the temperature of Dean's neck and arms were no longer cold, she dragged his body out of the sewage and back into the ice cave. This simple action was effortless for her in the past. But at this moment, she was so tired that she was panting. Although she had eaten a little food before, her physical strength still hadn't recovered. She sat beside Dean's body, physically and mentally exhausted. She had an impulse to lie down and sleep, but she resisted. After a few heavy breaths, she peeled off Dean's upper body armor, pulled out his underwear, wrung it dry, and then wiped his hair, cheeks, chest, and other parts of his body to prevent these water stains from freezing again under the guidance of the frozen disease in his body. After wiping the water stains on his upper body, her eyes suddenly fell on Dean's lower body. There was a flash of hesitation in her eyes, but she finally quickly untied Dean's combat pants and completely stripped them. She used Dean's vest as a towel and wiped all the water stains on his lower body. Then she wrung the vest again and wiped his armor, combat pants, and combat boots, squeezing out all the water stains that could be squeezed out. At this time, Dean's body was once again covered with a faint white frost, and the remaining water stains in his pores gradually froze. Aisha's face changed as she saw this, and she hurriedly used the vest to wipe again. In the process of wiping, she suddenly felt that Dean's body temperature was gradually dropping, becoming colder and colder. No, the temperature here is too low. There's nothing to keep me warm. Her eyes swept around, and the only thing she could find was some food and first aid supplies on the ground. There were no combustible things on the ground, including a fire sickle. She had dark vision and had always been alone, so she naturally didn't need a fire sickle. But at this moment, she was a little regretful. If there was a fire sickle, she could still ignite her combat boots and socks to keep warm. She looked at the unconscious Dean, and her eyes flashed a trace of complex color. After hesitating for a while, she bit her lips slightly, and a touch of faint red suddenly appeared on her pale cheeks. She raised her hand to untie her armor and took off her combat boots. Her snow-white skin was a kind of shocking beauty in this darkness. She raised her hand to hold Dean's shoulder, feeling like she was holding a piece of ice. A biting cold feeling came from her chest. She slightly gritted her teeth and hugged Dean's body tightly. Her toes touched the ground, and her body gently rubbed against Dean's body. In the darkness, she didn't know the sun was rising and the moon was falling. Aisha didn't know how long had passed, but she suddenly heard a slight sound in her ears. She opened her eyes and saw the things in the surrounding darkness. She was startled for a moment, and then realized that she had unknowingly fallen asleep. Feeling the softness and coldness under her body, she immediately looked down and saw that Dean was still lying flat under her. At this moment, his lips were slightly moving, as if he was slightly whispering. There was a flash of joy in her heart. After so long of hard work, Dean finally regained consciousness. Dean's face was pale, his eyes were closed, his brows were wrinkled, and his lips were whispering softly. His expression was a little painful, but also a little ferocious. She slightly leaned over and put her ear close to his lips to listen. When she heard his whisper, she was stunned for a moment. She slowly raised her head and stared at the boy, her eyes flashing slightly. She gently raised her hand to hold his cheek, and her fingers gently rubbed. "It will pass," she whispered, as if saying it to Dean, but also to herself. Chapter 562. Dean felt that he had had a long dream, but the moment he woke up, he couldn't remember the dream at all. A bone-chilling cold hit him. He subconsciously curled up his body and hugged each other, trying to shrink into a ball. "Are you awake?" A soft voice sounded, as if it came from the past. Dean was startled. This familiar voice gave him a feeling that he hadn't felt for a long time. It was like being awakened by his mother when he was a child. He couldn't help but open his eyes. What greeted his eyes was not the warm bed and sunny windowsill in his memory, but a burst of darkness. He slightly blinked his eyes to adapt to the darkness, and soon saw the ring-shaped ice cave behind the darkness. He suddenly sobered up. "Are you feeling better?" A soft voice came from the side. Dean turned his eyes and saw Aisha sitting on the side staring at him. There was a trace of softness in her eyes, not like her cold appearance in the past. Dean didn't think much about the change in her attitude. He was pleasantly surprised. "Are you awake? Your poison has been detoxified?" Seeing the eagerness and joy on his face, Aisha's mouth revealed a trace of a smile. "My poison has been temporarily stabilized. It's you who had fainted here. Fortunately, you have finally woken up." Dean was startled for a moment, and then he felt his whole body was cold. He looked down and saw that the armor on his body was somewhat disheveled. Cold wind poured into the collar and cuffs. He immediately straightened the armor, but there was a trace of doubt in his heart. He was very clear about his armor, but now it seemed that his armor had been moved. He couldn't help but look up at Aisha. Aisha noticed Dean's strange look, and her heart jumped. Her cheeks quickly turned light red. She turned her head and said, as if nothing had happened, "I checked your wound and took off your upper body armor. You have the frozen disease, but you dare to live in this ice sculpture fortress. Do you want to be buried with me?" She deliberately changed the topic and glanced at Dean. Dean smiled slightly and said, "I also want to go, but there's a monster waiting for me outside. He suddenly found that there was no monster outside in his sight. Moreover, the frozen water in front of him had disappeared, revealing the swaying water inside. The color of the water was a trace of turbid and scarlet, and there was a faint smell of blood. He couldn't help but turn a look at Aisha. "Did you kill that monster?" Aisha responded with a soft hum. Dean was a little stunned and said with a wry smile, "Sure enough, a skinny camel is still bigger than a horse." "I'm not a camel," Aisha corrected. Dean looked at her and suddenly remembered her previous words. He turned around and looked at his body. His face slightly changed. "How long was I in a coma?" "I don't know. You were in a coma when I woke up." Aisha estimated. "It should be a few days." "A few days?" Dean was stunned. He was suffering from ice blood disease. In such an environment, let alone a few days, even if he stayed for a few hours, he would freeze to death. He glanced at his left hand and suddenly froze. The skin color of his left hand was the same as before, as white as snow. The whole arm up to the shoulder was a snow-white color. In addition, there were dark blue spikes on the arm, extending along the back of the arm to the shoulder. These spikes didn't look like frozen ice, but some kind of hardened cuticle. Aisha noticed Dean's gaze and sighed in her heart. "You suffer from ice disease. When I woke up, you were already frozen. After you recovered, your arm was already like this. If I'm not wrong, your arm has completely frozen. In the future, you'd better not touch cold things, or the ice disease will spread to your whole body. At that time, you will no longer have human thinking, but become another you, no different from a zombie." Dean's body was shocked. He looked up at her and said, "Frozen disease? Do you mean ice blood disease?" Aisha nodded slightly. Ice blood disease is also called ice disease. People who suffer from this symptom will gradually freeze until they completely become an iceman. "No, it should be an ice demon. Is there a way to cure this?" Dean looked at her as if he was grasping at a straw. Aisha bit her lips slightly. "This is an incurable disease. Even our dragon family has no way to cure it. The only way to alleviate the outbreak of ice disease is to live in a high-temperature environment for a long time, such as soaking in a hot spring or in a room with a stove and fireplace. The higher the surrounding temperature, the better." Dean's face was ugly. The dragon family had a long history. Even they had no way to cure it. It was most likely that it was really difficult to cure. However, the current medical technology couldn't cure it, but it didn't mean that it wouldn't work in the future. He believed that after he developed medical technology, he would find a way to cure it and unveil the true face of God's blessing. "Since you are awake, leave here immediately." Aisha looked at Dean's pale face and said, "This place is too unfavorable for you. If you continue to stay, your ice disease will break out again." Dean nodded slightly. He also had the same intention. Suddenly, he thought of something. When Aisha woke up, he was frozen. Then in such a cold environment, how did his body temperature recover? He glanced at Aisha. He wanted to say something, but hesitated. Finally, he held back and said, "Then I'll go first. You stay here and recuperate. I'll go out and find something to eat for you." "No need. Just take care of yourself. I can hold on," Aisha said. Dean didn't say anything more. He dived into the water, opened his wings, and swam toward the square pool. Soon, he swam along the drainage channel to the square pool. He jumped out of the water and flew to a low altitude of more than 10 meters. Suddenly, he saw a huge shadow floating on the surface of the pool. It looked exactly like the previous underwater monster. At the moment, the body of the underwater monster was crawling with strange leech-like insects, as well as small demonic pests such as bloodthirsty flies. They occupied the body as a nest. It seemed that no one could escape the fate of being eaten. Dean sighed, turned around, and flew to the square pool. He looked around and saw some red spots moving in the nearby collapsed buildings. They were bone-biter rats. Chapter 563. In the dark building, several bone-biting rats were gnawing on the corpse of a 3 to 4 meter long python. Their sharp claws chiseled open the python's scales, scooped out the half-rotten flesh, and gnawed on it with relish. Dean put his hands on the ground and suddenly jumped out. Whoosh! Several bone-biter rats heard the movement, turned their heads vigilantly, and suddenly screamed. Puff! Puff! Dean stopped, holding a few mice with their skulls crushed. He glanced at the corpse of the python next to him. There was a fatal wound on its head that was so deep that the bone could be seen. The claw marks were large. It should have been injured by other monsters. After escaping here, it unfortunately became food for his former food. He put the corpses of several bone-biter rats into his backpack and continued to look for other bone-biter rats. After a while, he filled a bag full of bone-biter rats and came out of the dilapidated building. He took some dead branches as fuel and returned to the square pool. As soon as he got close, a stench floated from the water. It was the corpse of the underwater monster surrounded by strange insects. Dean glanced at it and went to the other direction to enter the water. He swam quickly along the drainage channel and soon returned to the hole in front of the ice cave. He climbed out of the water and threw the backpack and the dead branches on the shore. Then he stood on the shore and shook off the water stains on his body. He only felt a chill. "Are you okay?" Aisha had noticed that Dean had turned back. Seeing his pale face, she asked worriedly. Dean shook his head slightly and smiled at her. He bent down to open the backpack and poured out all the bone-biter rats inside. He said, "I haven't eaten for a few days. I'll eat these little guys first. I'll look for other things later." He put the bone-biter rats aside and then picked up the soaked dead branches and shook them. After shaking off the water, he peeled off the dead skin on the surface of the dead branches and crushed them into filaments. In this cold ice cave, the water on the dead branches evaporated quickly. After kneading them into hair-like filaments, he broke off 2 dead branches and sharpened them with Aisha's dagger. One of them was thicker, and the other was tapered. He used the oldest method of making fire, wood drilling. In the hole, he covered the dead skin filaments and quickly rubbed them. After a few minutes, smoke slowly floated up, and the hot temperature further evaporated the moisture on the wet filaments. After another 7 or 8 minutes, the smoke was getting bigger and bigger. Suddenly, a flame emerged from the hole. Dean's eyes lit up, and he carefully took care of it with his hands. Then he took out other dry silk and piled them up. He cut the dry branches into thin pieces and put them on top of the flame. Soon, the flame quickly burned and grew into a cluster of small bonfire. Aisha squatted next to Dean and stared at him. When the flame burned, her eyes lit up, revealing a bit of joy. Feeling the faint heat brought by the flame, she was a little happy. She never thought that this simple cluster of flame could make her feel happy. After the flame stabilized, Dean said to Aisha, "Come here and warm yourself. Take care of it and add some firewood." "Okay." Aisha nodded gently. She squatted and moved to the front of the fire. From time to time, she added the dead branches on the ground to the fire. At the same time, She turned her head to look at Dean. She saw him pick up the bone-biter rats on the ground, quickly cut their bodies with a dagger, and peel off the dirt. His movements were very skillful. After peeling off the fur of these bone-biter rats, Dean took out their internal organs and then dug a deep pit on the ground with his hands and buried all the internal organs. This was a habit of hunting in the wilderness, so that the bloody smell of the internal organs would not attract other monsters. It could also greatly slow down the decay of the internal organs and avoid the breeding of parasites in the rotten organs. These bone-biter rats were as big as rabbits in the old era. After peeling off the skin and dirt, only a bloody skeleton was left. Dean took out the dead branches and put them in front of the fire. He handed 2 to Aisha and said, "If you roast them a little bit, you should be able to eat them." Aisha glanced at the bloody bone-biter rats and didn't feel any bad. She took them and put them on the fire to roast. With her physique, there would be no problem even if she ate them raw. Her body's immune system could resist the bacteria hidden in the blood of the bone-biter rats. After all, in terms of strength alone, she could be regarded as a monster among the monsters. Blood dripped along the bone-biter rats' bodies into the fire. After roasting for more than 10 minutes, the blood on the bone-biter rats' bodies completely dried up and turned into a thin layer of blood film sticking to their bodies. A faint smell of blood slowly drifted out of their bodies. Dean felt a little greedy. He was already hungry. Half an hour later, all the bone-biter rats were roasted. Dean didn't stand on ceremony. He used a dagger to make a few cuts. Seeing that the flesh inside was completely cooked, he immediately moved his mouth to eat. After eating 2 roasted bone-biter rats, he felt a trace of warmth coming from his abdomen. His stiff body seemed to have recovered some flexibility. Aisha also ate heartily. She didn't pay attention to the way she ate, although there was no salt and cumin, but she still felt that it was very delicious even though she was starving. "How does it taste?" Dean looked at her wolfing down the food and smiled. "Delicious." Aisha swallowed the meat in her mouth and said contentedly. Dean smiled and turned to the side. He found a few small jars among the saltpeter, bandages, and other first aid items. There were tiny worms crawling in them. They were the parasitic soul worms he had collected before. He didn't have the opportunity to absorb them before. Now this ice cave was a relatively safe place. He didn't have to worry about being attacked by monsters during the absorption process. "What are you going to do?" Aisha saw Dean holding a few bottles of parasitic soul worms. She seemed to think of something and asked. Dean picked up a long box from the side and opened it. There was a syringe inside. He had specially brought it. He replied, "I'm going to absorb these little things to see if my strength can have a breakthrough." What he had experienced in the barren area made him understand that every bit of strength he gained here would increase his chances of survival. No one knew what he would encounter in the next moment. Maybe when he went out to look for food again, he would encounter demonic creatures that he could not escape from. Aisha was startled and said, "You want to use these high-level parasitic soul worms as nourishment?" Dean nodded. Aisha stared at him and nodded slightly. She said, "Although it's a bit extravagant and wasteful, it's also a way. Being able to survive is the most important thing. If I'm not wrong, your magic mark shouldn't be a rare magic mark, but the magic mark of the legendary monster Splitter, right?" Dean had expected that she might see through his magic mark. He nodded and said, "Yes." Aisha looked at him deeply and said, "Is it the magic mark of the child of the Splitter?" Dean didn't expect her to guess it at once. He glanced at her and nodded. "Yes, after you killed it, I followed its trail and found the little splitter it gave birth to." "I see." Aisha nodded slightly. "No wonder you can persist for so long under Parna's attack. The resources provided by the family should be enough for you to barely reach the primary frontiersman, right?" Dean's eyes flashed. He nodded and said, "Almost. It seems that I underestimated you at the beginning." Aisha said softly, "If I had known it earlier, I would have taken you back to the Dragon Clan. At that time, I was still a saintess. I could give you the best resources to cultivate. In this way, you're already a pioneer. With the legendary magic mark, you can be completely independent." Dean smiled and said, "If that's the case, I can't get this legendary magic mark." Chapter 564. Magic Weapon. Yes. Aisha nodded. Legendary magic marks are very different from other magic marks. There are 4 levels of magic marks: ordinary, rare, and legendary. If ordinary magic marks are number 1, rare magic marks are number 3, and rare magic marks are number 9, then legendary magic marks are number 1. There's a qualitative difference between the two. Dean was stunned. Ordinary magic marks can bring a relatively good additional ability to the inheritor. It is already a very good ordinary magic mark. Haisha said, a rare magic mark can trigger a new ability every time it is activated during the 3 stages of a hunter. Some of these abilities are strong, and some are weak. Some can only improve vision a little, while some are the core ability of the magic mark. For example, the blood cinder of your parasitic soulworm. Among the many abilities activated, the core ability is bound to appear, which is blood control. Not only can it absorb the blood of other organisms as nutrients to restore physical strength, but it can also transport its own blood to other organisms, causing the blood of the other party to be chaotic. If different blood types are mixed together, it will be fatal. This is also the main attack method of the blood cinder's magic mark. And if the inheritor of the blood cinder magic mark evolves to the pioneer level, it is said that it can also change the structure of blood. In other words, it can control the blood of other organisms and turn it into venom. It is very terrible. Dean was a little surprised. He couldn't help but look at the bottle in his hand. Was the blood cinder parasitic soul worm so powerful? Aisha stared at Dean and said, we judge the strength of a person's magic mark mainly according to the core ability of his magic mark. In addition to the core ability, the blood cinder magic mark will also provide the host with thermal vision, temperature control, and other abilities. But these are supplementary abilities. According to the different physique of each person, the supplementary abilities will be different after getting the same kind of magic mark, but the core ability will not change. As for the blood cinder, it's just one of the more common types of rare monsters. It's not even in the top 10 rare monsters. Dean was stunned and immediately understood what she meant. The blood cinder he got before was one of the top 10 rare monsters, and the splitter was a legendary monster. If an ordinary rare monster, the blood cinder, was so terrifying, then wouldn't the splitter's magic mark be even more terrifying? Aisha saw Dean's expression and knew that he understood her meaning. She nodded. At present, there are a total of 8 known legendary monsters, which are the 8 legendary magic marks. There are 2 reasons why the Magical Creature Research Institute regards them as legendary magical creatures. Firstly, they appear and disappear unpredictably. Secondly, the power they provide to their hosts is unimaginably powerful and has reached the extreme. Your splitter magic mark belongs to the extreme offensive type monster, and the shadow hunter you met before is the extreme stealth type monster. The abilities provided by these 2 areas have reached the extreme of known abilities. At this point, her eyes flashed and she whispered, you also know that the more times you evolve, the stronger your physique is, and the greater the changes in your body. Moreover, the changes brought about by some magic marks are permanent. Just like the wings on your back, they exist forever. This kind of change is more obvious after becoming a pioneer. Most of the pioneers will have part of their body mutate and become a monster that is neither human nor beast. They can only hide in the dark and are despised and feared by the nobles. Hearing her words, Dean couldn't help but look at her. From head to toe, this girl didn't seem to have the slightest shadow of beastification. Aisha saw Dean's reaction and guessed his thoughts. This is the magic weapon I want to tell you about. From the root, the reason why our body will be beastified, in addition to being penetrated by the magic marks, is also because our body is seeking this kind of change. The stronger the power, the greater the change, and the more the need for beastification. You must have felt it during the battle. Our human body is not suitable to perfectly exert the ability of our magic marks. This is because the monster that the magic marks use to reside in is too different from the human body. Listening to her words, Dean suddenly recalled the feeling of the previous battle with Eugene. There was indeed a feeling that his whole body was bound and couldn't exert his power. He always felt that there was something missing in his body, just like a crippled limb. In order to avoid beastification and become a non-human monster, the Monster Research Institute invented the magic weapon. Aisha said, "The meaning of the magic weapon is to replace the beastification of the human body." She raised her hand and pointed to the giant sword wrapped in a cloth on her back. "My blood vessel is a magic weapon. It is cast from the corpse of the original owner of my magic marks, my blood, and half of my magic marks. So my body can avoid beastification, and at the same time, it can perfectly exert the fighting power of my own magic marks. When I need to exert the power that can only be exerted when part of my body is beastified, I only need to stimulate my magic weapon to complete the beastification form." Dean was stunned. He couldn't help but look at the giant sword on her back. An incredible idea popped up in his mind. He said in amazement, "You mean the sword on your back can change?" "Yes." Aisha nodded. "If my magic marks are the magic marks of the splitter, stimulating my magic weapon will make my body become the appearance of the splitter and release the power of the magic marks 100%. Dean was stunned. Could it be that this magic weapon was a genetic weapon? However, with the technology of this world, how could such a high-end genetic weapon be made? What kind of secret was hidden in the Monster Research Institute? Could it be that the technology of the old era was not cut off, but was controlled by a small number of people? Although it is a little difficult to cut off the lower part of the magic marks to cast a magic weapon like you, there's still a way, but the price will be a little higher." Aisha said, "If you have a magic weapon, your fighting power will be at least 5 times more than now, and you can even fight with the pioneers with rare magic marks." Dean was pulled back from his thoughts by her words. When he heard the last part, he couldn't help but jump. A magic weapon could let him fight with the pioneers? You know, he was not a primary frontiersman like Aisha thought, but a hunter. In other words, if he became a primary frontiersman, with the help of the magic weapon, it would not only be a fight, but it was possible to defeat or even kill the pioneers. Chapter 565. Soon, the Bloodsender's parasitic soul worm was injected into the magic mark. Dean felt a slight heat in his chest, dispersing a lot of the surrounding cold air. He didn't stop and continued to take out the second parasitic soul worm, which was the corpse pecker's parasitic soul worm, loading and injecting. Another rare parasitic soul worm was injected into Dean's magic mark and turned into pure nutrients. After the injection, Dean felt that his whole body was swollen. A blazing warmth spread from the magic mark on his chest to all parts of his body. He didn't feel the slightest cold. It was as if he was in a hot summer street. He took a deep breath and continued to take out the parasitic soul worm and load it into the syringe. As the third parasitic soul worm was injected into the magic mark, Dean felt that the magic mark on his chest was faintly trembling, as if something was about to break out of the magic mark. This wonderful feeling reminded him of the feeling he had when he stimulated the magic mark several times before. The energy is almost saturated. Dean's eyes brightened. He looked down at the remaining 2 bottles in his hand, which contained the Wind Listener's parasitic soul worm and the Shadow Hunter's parasite egg. His eyes flashed, and he took out the Shadow Hunter's parasite egg, loaded it into the syringe, and injected it into his body. With the injection of the parasite egg, Dean immediately felt his whole body swelling. His hair stood up, and his muscles couldn't help but tremble. His body automatically entered a state of excitement. Just a little bit more. Dean clenched his fists. He felt the blood in his body boiling and burning. Just a little bit more, and he would be able to completely boil and burst out of his body. His eyes suddenly fell on the remaining Wind Listener parasitic soul worm. This was the task item. If he brought it back and handed it in, he could exchange it for a medal. A cold light flashed in his eyes. He quickly unscrewed the bottle, took out the struggling parasitic soul worm, loaded it into the syringe, and injected it into the magic mark on his chest without hesitation. After being hunted by the young man of the Wings clan and being frozen into a coma twice, he had already realized that it was a fantasy to exchange medals for freedom dutifully. It would only give an unreachable hope to those who were mired in desperation and mud. In this barren area where danger lurked everywhere, only one's own strength could ensure one's survival. As the wind listener's parasitic soulworm was injected into the magic marks, Dudian suddenly felt that the temperature in his body had risen to the extreme. It suddenly boiled again, like a volcano had erupted. The blazing air swept through his body, as if he was in a sea of fire. The intense heat made him feel like his entire body was melting, and the pain was unbearable. At the same time, in his already confused and fuzzy hearing, he faintly heard a cracking sound coming from nearby. Panting heavily, he looked towards the source of the sound and was instantly stunned. On the surface of his body, flame-like patterns appeared, covering his entire body. There seemed to be bright red lava flowing within these patterns, and the most complicated part of these patterns was the demonic mark on his chest. Amidst the flowing bright red lines, his body seemed to slowly crack open. At the same time, from his arms and the back of his hands, a faint white color slowly floated up, as if the bones in his body were floating up, slowly covering the flesh and blood of his entire body. Not good. Suddenly, Haisha shouted from the side. Dudian was puzzled. Just as he was about to turn his head, he suddenly felt a pain in the back of his head. Darkness rushed into his eyes, and he suddenly fainted. For a long, long time, feeling a little sore in his neck, Dudian slowly woke up. He opened his eyes and looked around. He was still in a dark ice cave. He breathed a sigh of relief and slowly sat up from the ground. Memories suddenly came to his mind, and he could not help but turn his head to look. "You're awake." Haisha came over from the ice bed behind him. Dudian looked at her doubtfully. "Did you knock me out before?" "Yes." Haisha nodded gently. "I didn't expect you to be at the limit of a primary frontiersman. Relying on these parasitic soulworms, you directly broke through to a senior frontiersman. Your body has changed a lot. If I didn't knock you out, you would have broken through successfully. But in that case, your body would have changed forever, and it would be difficult for you to enter the world of normal people in the future." Dudian was stunned. "So, I failed to break through now?" "Not really." Haisha shook her head slightly and said, "It should be said that you've succeeded halfway. You can be regarded as half a senior frontiersman. When you're fighting, you can still adjust the state of your body to stimulate the previous state of beastification. When you're not fighting and calm down, this state will also fade away, and your body will still be like this." Dudian was startled, and his mind couldn't help but recall the changes in his body that he had seen previously. The bones in his body seemed to have been transferred to the outside of the body, and the bones were wrapped in flesh and blood. The purpose of such a beastification state should be to make the surface of the body harder and more destructive power of the splitter. However, if this state continued, he would look like a skeleton. In the future, when he returned to the wall, even if he didn't have the identity of the Dark Church, he would forever live in the dark. No one could accept such a horrible appearance. "Thank you," Dudian said to Haisha. Haisha breathed a sigh of relief and said, "You don't blame me. If you want to continue to break through, you only need to inject any parasitic soulworm or a bottle of God's marrows to stimulate your body to enter the state of breakthrough again. However, I suggest you wait until I help you make a magic weapon. In this way, your beastification state will be sealed in the magic weapon in the future, and it won't affect your normal life in the wall." Dudian nodded silently. It was enough to burst out the power of a primary frontiersman in a fight. However, the appearance of the previous external appearance of the skeleton had left a shadow in his heart. "This is for you. Do you want to try it on?" Haisha handed over a black furry thing with both hands, but her head was tilted to the other side. Dudian glanced at it. It turned out to be the fur of the previously peeled bone-biter rat. It seemed to have been sewn into a coat. He looked up at Haisha and said, "Did you make it?" Haisha grunted and said, "You made it when you were unconscious." "Wasn't I in a coma for a long time?" Dudian was surprised. Aisha turned to look at him and said calmly, "Do you mean I make things slowly?" Dudian didn't expect her face to change so quickly. He quickly said, No, I'm just worried that I slept for too long and delayed things. It's better not to. Aisha handed the thing to Dadian and said, the temperature here is low. Try it first. Chapter 566. Hearing Dean's words, Aisha felt her cheeks were hot. She turned around and said angrily, don't talk nonsense. You're glib-tongued. Dean raised his head in astonishment. Wasn't this an exaggeration? How did it become glib-tongued? He recalled and immediately realized that these words were indeed ambiguous. He immediately said, I was wrong, but I was praising your craftsmanship. I didn't expect you to do these sewing and mending things. Why can't I do it? Aisha was angry in her heart and refuted his words. Dean was tongue-tied. He scratched his head and said, aren't you a saint? I thought you only do things that saints do. Aisha snorted and said, this kind of thing is not difficult. If I can't do this, how can I be a saint? Dean saw that her words were filled with anger, so he immediately shut his mouth and stopped talking. Aisha found that Dean didn't answer. She waited for a long time, but there was still no sound. She turned around and glanced at Dean, but she saw that he was looking at her. Their eyes met. Her cheeks were hot, and she was embarrassed. She quickly turned her head and said, the temperature here is low. If you have nothing to do, go outside and stay. Dean looked at her strangely and nodded. Then I'll go find something to eat. Aisha nodded in agreement. When she heard the splashing sound behind her, she quickly turned her head and saw the rippling surface of the water. Dean's figurehead quickly swam out. She bit her lips slightly, and her eyes followed the heat source in the water slowly, until the heat source disappeared from her sight. She slowly retracted her gaze, and there was a trace of confusion in her eyes. After Dean left the square pool, he quickly shook off the water stains on his body, spread his wings, and flew straight to the place where the 4 shadow hunter eggs were previously stored. A moment later, he came to the top of the dilapidated building. Looking down from a high altitude, he saw several streets around the building, with undeads and some small monsters with ferocious postures wandering around. Without saying a word, he quickly rushed into the building, rushed in through the broken window, folded his wings, and landed on the ground. There were broken glass shards everywhere, covered with a thick layer of dust, and when he stepped on them, there was a creaking sound. The smell of shadow hunter eggs immediately assaulted his nostrils. He followed the direction of the smell. This place seemed to be an office building. There were several office chairs on the ground and several human skeletons wrapped in clothes and covered in dust. Soon, he came to the room where the shadow hunter eggs were hidden. He pushed the door open and was startled. Out of the 4 eggs he had hidden here, 2 of them had broken. His heart skipped a beat, and his eyes swept around, revealing a bit of vigilance. He gently lifted his feet and slowly walked towards the egg, not making a single sound. As he got closer, he immediately saw that there was nothing inside the 2 cracked oval eggs. One of the eggs was only left with a dry shell, while the other had a small amount of viscous liquid inside. He reached out and touched it. It was still viscous, so it should have hatched not long ago. As for the other egg, it should have been hatched for some time. It seems that the time I was unconscious in the ice cave with her is a bit long. Should be a week or 2. Dean's eyes flashed slightly, and his pupils shrank slightly. He turned his head to look at the surrounding darkness. There were still 2 eggs here, which meant that the hatched shadow hunter was still wandering around and hadn't gone far. He suddenly regretted not bringing Aisha's dagger when he came out. If he fought barehanded, the blood of the shadow hunter would cause corrosive damage to his arm. After looking around for a while, Dean slowly withdrew from the room, his palm grabbing the wall. The wallpaper on the wall had long fallen off, and the putty powder inside had also been peeled off. He casually grabbed and dug out a large lump of cement and sand. He gently kneaded it into powder, turned his head to look around, and then raised his hand to sprinkle the powder around. The fluffy powder scattered on the surrounding walls and ground. Suddenly, Dean saw that part of the powder that escaped behind him was stuck on the wall next to him. He was startled for a moment, and suddenly a chill rose in his heart. He suddenly raised his hand to hit it. Whoosh! The wall suddenly changed, revealing the appearance of a shadow hunter. It opened its mouth and pounced toward Dean. Dean's fist hit the carapace on its chest, causing the carapace to slightly cave in. However, the next moment, several of its limbs quickly hugged over and firmly clasped his arm. Dean felt a tingling pain on his arm, like being scratched. His face changed. Thinking of what Aisha said, he hurriedly controlled the muscles of his whole body to tremble, and the blood in his body instantly surged like boiling. At the same time, his vision became clearer. In his sight, the shadow hunter became translucent, and the veins, blood vessels, and joint structures in the surface of the carapace were vivid in his mind. Squeak! The shadow hunter seemed to sense something and let out a sharp cry. Dean suddenly saw snow-white bones emerging on his arms and shoulders. Different from the bones he saw before he passed out, the bones that emerged this time were more complete, like a layer of bone carapace, in a vertical shape, wrapping his arm. Bright red skin was exposed in the gap between each vertical bone. There were no pores on the surface of the skin, like a piece of flesh and blood. Dean glanced at it, and without thinking much, he quickly attacked the shadow hunter's head, trying to make it loosen its grip. The shadow hunter's limbs tightly hugged Dean's arm, and its sharp claws struggled to grab his arm, trying to tear it off. However, Dean only felt a trace of itch, without the slightest pain. Bang! When he swung his fist, he felt a touch of white passing through his sight, followed by a large amount of green. Dean was stunned. Only when he felt a burning pain on his arm did he react. He hurriedly jumped back, but he heard a plop sound. The shadow hunter that was hugging his arm fell to the ground, and its head was completely broken. Dead? Dean was a little stunned. He couldn't help but look at his hand, which was covered with green blood mucus. He hurriedly shook off the blood on his hand, found some dusty hardened cloth on the corpse on the ground, and wiped his arm until the blood was almost wiped off. He saw that his 5 fingers and the back of his hand were all covered with strips of white bone, and on the back of the middle finger, there were 3 white bone spikes more than 10 centimeters long. When clenched into a fist, these 3 spikes were like 3 sharp blades. Dean was startled and gradually recovered. He was a little shocked. He didn't expect that just one evolution would bring about a strength increase several times. This shadow hunter was about the same size as the previous one, and its strength was also similar. If it was before, he would have to spend more effort to kill it, especially in the case of no weapon, and he would be injured. But now he had easily killed him with a single punch. Chapter 567. Dean let his body slowly relax, and the white bones on his body slowly sank into his body. The surface of his body returned to its previous normal appearance, but the place covered by the bones left a red mark, like a burn scar. The color of the scar gradually faded, slowly fading. Dean breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. He turned his head and glanced around, but he didn't see anything unusual. 2 of the 2 shadow hunters had hatched, and the remaining one had just hatched not long ago. He didn't know if it was eaten by the shadow hunter or if it was hiding. He didn't intend to continue to wait here. He cut open the shadow hunter's body, picked up a vine from the ground, and rummaged inside. Soon, he found a sleeping parasite egg. He took out a bottle from his backpack and sealed the parasite egg in it. Then he turned back to the room, picked up the remaining 2 eggs, and was ready to leave. At this moment, 3 red heat sources appeared in his field of vision. They were humanoid, walking from the other side of the street. Their movements were agile and vigilant. Dean was startled and suddenly thought that they should be the other Dragon Huang squad. He held the 2 eggs and came to the broken window. He converged his breath, and at the same time, the blood in his body surged again, stimulating the white bone form. In this form, his body's heat source could be covered by the bones, undetectable, and his own smell would also be reduced. With the open view from a high place, he looked at the street where the 3 heat sources were. He saw that they were walking along the street. Judging from the direction they were going, they would soon pass the street next to his building. He lowered his body, his eyes flashing slightly, and observed. The 3 heat sources soon appeared at the corner of the street. Sure enough, they were 3 people wearing Dragon Clan armor, 2 men and 1 woman. One of the young men was wearing the same basic armor as Dean. Dean looked at them attentively. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed. He saw that behind the three figures, there was a figure in black armor. Judging from the width of the figure, it should be a male. He was wearing a black helmet, and his face couldn't be seen clearly. He was holding a machete in his hand, and it seemed that he was guarding the rear of the team. A normal team has 7 people, but there are only 4 of them. Did they also encounter some danger and lost 3 people? Dean's eyes flashed slightly, and his head slightly shrank back to avoid being seen by them. Soon, the Dragon Desolate squad came to the street next to the building. They walked against the wall, their movements light, and did not make a sound. When they encountered the sleeping corpses that crawled up from the ground, they immediately grabbed their necks and twisted them slightly, killing them, making the corpses unable to even let out a roar. Hiss! Suddenly, Dean heard the cries of bone-biter rats coming from the 2-story building under his feet. The bone-biter rats that were foraging in the 2-story building seemed to sense the danger of these people. They screamed in horror and fled to their nests in the walls of the building. The 4 people downstairs heard the screams of the bone rats. They looked up and saw that there was no abnormality, so they continued to walk forward. This team is so strong. Dean squatted on the edge of the window, and his heart was secretly awestruck. Judging from the heat source alone, the other middle-aged man and the woman in the team had the physique of a high-level frontiersman, and their heat concentration was similar to Martin's. As for the man in black behind the team who didn't emit heat, he seemed to be stronger. Only the young man in the standard armor was the weakest, with the heat concentration of a primary frontiersman. It should be known that in his original team, only Martin and Ian were high-level frontiersmen, and the others were primary frontiersmen. Suddenly, Dean felt a chill coming from the top of his head. It was like an icicle piercing straight into his head, and then straight into the spine behind his neck. He felt cold from head to toe, and the hair on his back stood up. Whoosh! A black shadow suddenly drilled out of the collapsed building on the other side of the street and pounced on the 4 people on the street. Dean's eyelids twitched, and he instinctively felt a sense of fear. He hurriedly shrank his body and hid under the window, tightly clinging to the wall, not daring to reveal half of his figure. A scream full of pain sounded from the street. There's an ambush! Is he human? Too fast, run. We are not his opponent. Several voices came from the street, full of horror and anger. Although Dean didn't look, but from his thermal vision he could see that among the 3 figures on the street, the middle-aged man who was walking in front had fallen to the ground, and the heat source of his body was rapidly dropping. At the same time, the young man and the woman behind him turned and fled, as if they were being chased by the god of death. With a scream outside the window, Dean saw the slower young man suddenly fall to the ground. The moment he fell to the ground, a terrible red figure emerged behind him. It was a human figure, but the heat concentration emitted was extremely terrifying, as strong as blood. It was comparable to Hathaway, or even stronger. The bloody figure flashed and disappeared. The next moment, when it appeared again, it was behind the woman. The woman hurriedly turned around and seemed to want to fight back, but the bloody figure's palm instantly pierced through her chest and came out from her back. The length of the arm was extremely amazing, and it seemed to be flexible. The bloody figure quickly withdrew its hand and disappeared again. In less than 2 seconds, another scream came from the street, and the bloody figure disappeared as soon as it appeared. Dean's whole body was covered in cold sweat. His body was tense, and he controlled his heartbeat rate to reduce to 1 beat every 10 seconds. He knew that once he was detected by the bloody figure, he would be in danger. Although his strength had improved, there was still a big gap between him and this monster that could easily kill 4 dragon guards in 10 seconds. This was by no means the level of an ordinary pioneer. Is it another pioneer from another race who sneaked in? Dean was shocked when he thought of the words of the previous people before they died. At this time, a cracking sound came from the quiet street, like a beast tearing bones, accompanied by a slight smacking sound. Dean held his breath, slowly raised his head, and looked out the window. He only took a glance, and quickly shrank his head so as not to be noticed by the other party. Although the process was short, the scene on the street was captured in his mind like a camera, and his face could not help but show a shocked expression. Chapter 568. Someone from the Dragon Clan actually hunted the Dragon Guards? Dean felt somewhat incomprehensible. Judging from the strength of this person, he was definitely not a Dragon Guard. He was probably one of the strong Dragon Clans stationed in the Wasteland. But such a strong person actually disregarded the interests of the Dragon Clan and hunted his own people. And judging from the situation, it seemed that he simply wanted to eat them. Soon, he thought of another possibility. Wearing the Dragon Clan's armor doesn't necessarily mean that he is from the Dragon Clan. Could it be that he is a pioneer from another family in disguise? Or could it be that this person is a spy planted in the Dragon Clan by another family? Thinking of this, his face turned ugly. In any case, he had seen this person's secret. Once it was exposed, he would be hunted down and silenced. In the silent street, the breeze blew gently, like a sigh. The sound of chewing and swallowing lasted for more than 10 minutes. Dean felt that his whole body was faintly sore, as if he had been training for several days and nights. He could not help but look at his hands. He saw that the white bones on his arms were gradually lightening and sinking a lot. He was secretly shocked. Maintaining this state seemed to be reaching the limit. He hurriedly tightened his body and continued to prop up the white bones. If he lost the heat insulation of the white bones at this time, he was likely to be exposed. Gulp, gulp, gulp. The sound of swallowing and drinking came from the street. But without thinking, he knew that the latter was not drinking water, but blood. After another 4 or 5 minutes, the chewing sound on the street stopped. Dean's heart trembled, and he held his breath. The silent street seemed to be even quieter, and the whistling wind seemed to be grinning strangely. Dean felt that his whole body was sore and swollen, and he was almost unable to hold on. He slightly gritted his teeth, slowly squatted a little, and looked out of the window. Suddenly, he saw that the bloody figure had disappeared. On the empty street, there were only 4 skeletons lying there quietly. Their bodies were ragged from being bitten, their armors were torn, and the internal organs in their stomachs were slipping to the ground. On the chest, neck, arms, and other parts of the corpses there were bite marks. If he had not seen the bloody figure eat with his own eyes, he would have thought that they were eaten by the undead. Dean was relieved to see that the man had left. He slowly relaxed his body. The white bone quickly sank into his body. He gasped for breath for a moment and did not dare to stay here any longer. He picked up the 2 eggs and quickly rushed toward the pool in the square. Along the way, he looked around vigilantly, especially paying attention to the movements of the bone-biter rats. He felt that the reason why the bone-biting rats under his building suddenly screamed and returned to their nests was not because they were afraid of the dead man on the street, but because they had sensed this bloody figure. Perhaps ordinary people wouldn't be able to sense the blood-red figure, but the bone-biting rats had a way to predict it. He sneaked toward the area where the bone-biter rats were active. He went around a few streets, caught 2 bone-biter rats, and threw them into his backpack as sensors to sense the bloody figure. He carried the 2 eggs and went straight back to the pool in the square. He jumped into the water and quickly swam back to the ice cave. "You're back." Dean heard Aisha's voice as soon as he jumped out of the water. He looked at her and saw her sitting on the ice bed. Her pair of clear eyes were looking at him softly with a bit of softness. He nodded slightly, put the shadow hunter's egg aside, shook off the water stains on his body, took off the blood-biter rat sweater, wrung it dry, and put it aside. Then he opened his backpack, took out the 2 bone-biter rats, and threw them on the ground. The 2 bone-biter rats were in the backpack. As soon as they came out, they ran around in panic. However, they were surrounded by ice, and the only exit was the water. They were naturally afraid of water. Although they could swim, and it was difficult for them to drown, their fear of water made them not dare to go into the water easily. Just 2. Aisha was a little surprised. With Dean's skill, it should be easy to catch bone-biter rats. Dean sighed and said, "These 2 are not food. They are used as warning devices." Warning device? Aisha was puzzled. Dean told her about the previous encounter and said, "Originally, I planned to take these 2 eggs and go back to the Shadow Hunter's nest to bring back our team's food bag. But I was afraid that I would meet that person on the way, so I came back first." Aisha was immersed in his previous narration. When he finished, she came back to her senses. There was a trace of coldness in her eyes. She said, "The person you're talking about is not a pioneer from another family, but a despicable villain." Dean was surprised and said, "Do you know him? Is this person really from the dragon family?" Aisha's expression was gloomy. She nodded slightly and said, "This person is one of the 8 generals guarding the wasteland. His nickname is Ghoul. He became a pioneer 20 years ago and is one of the elders of our dragon family. But because of his unruly character, he was sent to guard the wasteland." Dean was startled and looked at her. "So, this person is your subordinate?" Aisha nodded slightly and said, "This person usually likes to take advantage of his seniority and doesn't listen to commands. Moreover, he has a very disgusting hobby, which is what you have seen, eating people." Dean was startled. He had seen all kinds of criminals in Thornflower Prison. Some were wronged, and some were really vicious. These villains had many twisted hobbies, but none of them had such a perverted hobby. Sure enough, the higher the position, the heavier the taste. Usually, I am in charge of him, so he doesn't dare to act rashly. I didn't expect that after I left for such a short time, he would dare to sneak into the orange wasteland and hunt the dragon guards. Aisha's face was cold and said, "This should not be the first time he has done such a thing. No wonder our dragon family's dragon guards have always been in a high position." Dean's eyes flashed slightly, but he didn't say anything. If it was before he was imprisoned, he would definitely ask why this person was tolerated to be one of the 8 generals of the wasteland, since he was so vile. But now, he already had an answer in his heart. Because to the dragon clan, this person's value was greater than the harm he would cause. So even though they knew that he had such a vile hobby, they still turned a blind eye to it. Everything in the world seemed to be like this. The so-called moral criticism was just the humble groan of the weak. This scum. Aisha slightly gritted her teeth and touched the wound on her shoulder with her palm. Her eyes were full of hatred. Dean saw her action and advised, "When your injury is healed, go back and don't have a head-on conflict with this person. You don't have any evidence. If you want to deal with him, do it secretly." Aisha looked at him and nodded, yes. Dean didn't want to participate too much in the affairs of the dragon family. He turned his head and glanced around and said with a wry smile, "It seems that we are going to starve tonight." Chapter 569. Dragon Blood Technique? Yes. Aisha said, "This is one of the core secret techniques of our dragon clan. It's an amplification secret technique in the Dragon Emperor's secret technique. If you learn it for the first time, you can raise your body temperature and resist the cold. It's most suitable for practicing in extremely cold places." Dean was startled. Now he was no longer the person who knew nothing about the Dragon Clan. The Dragon Emperor's secret technique was the core secret technique above the Dragon Thorn's secret technique. Only the Patriarch and the Saintess of the Dragon Clan were qualified to practice it. In the Dragon Clan, the taboo of secretly learning the secret technique was very deep, and the punishment was severe. That was why Haley chose to use the secret technique to frame Aisha. If you teach me, won't it violate the rules of the clan?" Dean asked calmly with a trace of temptation and reminder in his heart. Aisha said indifferently, "Anyway, in those people's eyes, I have already sent it to you once. It doesn't matter if I send it to you again now. Besides, my saintess identity has been taken away. There is nothing that can be taken away by them except my life. However, they won't kill me. Even if I teach you the entire secret skill of the Dragon King, they won't kill me, nor will they punish me, because the greatest punishment is to guard the barren area." Speaking of this, she stared at Dean and said, "Do you dare to learn it if I teach you?" Dean looked at her deep eyes and suddenly smiled. "Of course, as long as you dare to pass it to me, I dare to learn. Even if you don't pass it to me, I will steal it if I get the opportunity." A smile appeared on Aisha's face. "I know you are very bold." Dean said, Actually, it's not bold enough. Haisha smiled and said, as long as you and I don't say anything about this, no one will know. Just try not to use it outside. But if you have no other choice, use it. If something happens, I will take full responsibility. Dean nodded slightly, but secretly said in his heart, as long as I get through this period, I won't have to bear anyone's punishment when my new secret technique is completed. Get ready to start. Haisha said, take off your coat and armor first. Shake your muscles to keep warm. I'll explain the principle of dragon blood spell to you. Dean nodded slightly and did as he was told. As soon as he took off his armor, cold air covered his entire body, causing him to shiver uncontrollably. The key to cultivating the dragon blood art lies in the word blood. Aisha spoke quickly, but not impatiently. To practice the dragon blood art, you must first reach the level of a senior hunter and learn to control the heartbeat rate. With your current physique and control of your body, you can already train to control the heartbeat rate. Aisha spoke quickly, but she wasn't impatient. Dean's body slightly trembled as he said, I know this. You can. A strange look flashed in Aisha's eyes. Although it was said that one could learn to control the heartbeat frequency after reaching senior hunter, this was only applicable to those geniuses who had created records in history. For most ordinary people, even those who had reached senior limitless might not be able to learn to control the heartbeat frequency, let alone practice the dragon blood technique. Since you can, first control your heartbeat to increase the frequency. First, 300 beats per minute, Aisha said. Dean immediately knew what she was thinking. The faster the heartbeat, the faster the pumping speed, and the body temperature would naturally rise. For ordinary people, a heart rate of 300 beats per minute would instantly overload the heart, cause heart failure, or even die from myocardial infarction. But for him, it was not the limit of his endurance. Thump, thump. He controlled his heartbeat to increase rapidly. Every time it beat, the backflow of blood would expand and flow into his whole body, causing his blood circulation to be extremely fast. His body slowly produced a heat. It should be known that an ordinary person's body temperature would rise by 1 degree for every 15 to 20 beats of heartbeat. An ordinary person's heart rate was 60 to 100 beats per minute. With Dean's current heartbeat rate, if he didn't suffer from ice blood disease, his body temperature would reach about 45 degrees. However, although he felt a trace of warmth at the moment, this warmth was tightly compressed near his heart by the cold air. The temperature of his heart had reached about 38 or 39 degrees, but his hands and feet were far away from his heart. His nerves and blood vessels were relatively delicate, so the blood transmission was slow, and it was still freezing cold. Especially near his left shoulder was bone-chilling, causing the left half of his body to shiver with cold. Aisha moved a little closer to Dean's chest, listening and silently counting. After a minute, Dean's heartbeat rate accurately reached 300 beats, no more and no less. This control was far more accurate than she had imagined. And accuracy meant that there was still strength to spare. The dragon blood method mainly uses the blood in the body, and to use blood, you need to use the heart. Aisha said, to a large extent, the strength of a person depends on the blood in the body. Blood is the flowing energy in the body. When we are angry, we often feel the blood in the body boiling, flushing our face and ears. This is because the frequency of blood flow has accelerated and rushed to the brain. At this time, we often feel that we have infinite strength and are relatively numb to pain. We can easily pick up things that can't be picked up under normal conditions. So, controlling the blood is equivalent to controlling the strength, Aisha explained to Dean. After he persisted for another 2 minutes, she said, try to increase it by 100 more. If you feel that it's too hard, stop. The exercise of the heart is very dangerous, and it's easy to get into trouble. Therefore, the practice of the dragon blood method must be supervised by someone. Even if the heart suddenly stops, you can be rescued in time. Dean nodded slightly, controlling the frequency of his heartbeat to continue to increase. Aisha stared at his chest, which was covered with scars on his fair skin. Although she had seen it once before, seeing it again at this moment was still a bit shocking. It was not difficult to guess what kind of torture and experience this young man had suffered. Her eyes flickered slightly, and her lips softly whispered. After a minute, this time Dean's heartbeat rate reached 400, still accurate. A trace of seriousness flashed in her eyes. Even a senior Lemeter would find it difficult to reach a heart rate of 400 beats per minute. But for Dean, this was not his limit. She looked up at Dean and saw that his expression was calm, but his breathing was slightly rough. She was more convinced of the guess in her heart. She did not continue to let Dean increase his heart rate to touch his limit. After all, without any exercise, it was difficult for the heart to bear to approach the limit. From now on, control the heartbeat rate to reduce the frequency of 10 beats per second, all the way to 20 beats per minute, Aisha said. Dean immediately did as she said. Soon, the heartbeat became slower and slower. 20 beats per minute was also lower than the average person, but for him, it was far from the limit. 10 beats per minute, Aisha said. Dean slowed down his heartbeat again. As the frequency of the heartbeat became slower, the surrounding cold air became heavier and heavier. Aisha said, slowing down your heartbeat doesn't mean suppressing your heartbeat rate, but lengthening it. This will help to exercise your heart muscle. When your heartbeat rate is lengthened, your heart will store more blood when pumping. When the blood is gushing out, the speed and volume of the blood will increase. Even if the heartbeat rate is 10 beats per minute, the heat it brings will be equivalent to the effect of 400 beats per minute. Dean was slightly startled. Lengthening the heartbeat? Exercise the heart muscle? It was the first time he thought that the heart muscle could be exercised. However, according to Aisha, if the heartbeat rate was lengthened, it could indeed exercise the heart muscle, so that the amount of blood pumped with each heartbeat would be greatly increased. Chapter 570. The heart is like a mouth in our body, Aisha said. Haisha said, the tougher your mouth is, the more blood it will store. When your heart muscle is stronger, you can practice the dragon blood technique. You can stimulate the blood in your body at will, increase your strength, and change your body state. You can also further control the flow trend and speed of the blood in your body to stop bleeding. Dean nodded slightly. Even if Aisha didn't explain in detail, as a modern person, he knew the relationship between the heart and blood and the mystery in between. He could understand it with just a little explanation. Lengthen the heartbeat. Aisha leaned close to Dean's scarred chest, listening to the slow heartbeat in his chest, and said at the same time, Dean slowly lengthened the heartbeat, like a person taking a deep breath. The amount of blood he inhaled was extremely rich, filling his heart, and then burst out. The blood suddenly flowed into the whole body at a very fast speed. Because the speed was too fast, it instantly rushed to his arms and feet, causing his hands and feet to feel a trace of heat. Seeing the effect, Dean's eyes brightened. He closed his eyes and concentrated on controlling his heart, lengthening the heartbeat and increasing the amount of blood he inhaled. Thump! Thump! Every heartbeat was like a muffled thunder in his chest, extremely loud and clear. Although the interval between heartbeats was extremely long, the rhythm was stable, and every interval seemed to be accumulating and brewing. Not bad, you understand it very fast. Aisha saw that Dean had understood the mystery and involuntarily lengthened the heartbeat to exercise the heart muscle. She couldn't help but nod with satisfaction, and there was a trace of appreciation in her eyes. In the dark ice cave, he was unaware of the passage of time. Dean didn't know how long he had been exercising, but he gradually felt a trace of tiredness, and his control of the heart was somewhat inadequate. At the same time, there was a burst of hunger in his abdomen, as if there was a black hole that could suck his whole body in. He opened his eyes and saw Aisha staring at him. His exhausted heart beat for a moment, but he quickly regained his calmness. I'm hungry. Let's eat something first and then practice. Okay. Aisha withdrew her gaze and nodded. It was her first time to practice for so long, which had already exceeded her expectations. She should be tired by now. These two bone biter rats, you eat one and keep the other as a warning. Aisha pointed to the two bone biter rats on the ground and said. Dean glanced at it and shook his head slightly, saying, "Keep it. This little thing has no meat. I'll find something else to eat." "No, it's too dangerous to go out now," Aisha said immediately. Dean saw her determined look, and his heart warmed. "I didn't say that I would go out. If you want to find food, you don't have to look for it yourself. You can let the food come to your door." Aisha was slightly startled and looked at him doubtfully. Dean first put on the armor and the rat coat on the ground. At this moment, his heart had returned to normal, and the heat in his body was gradually subsiding. He had to keep warm and find food as soon as possible. After all, the heat promoted by the blood flow could not be maintained for a long time. He picked up the dagger on the ground and went to the water at the entrance of the cave. He cut his arm and blood dripped into the water. When he was training his heart, he thought of this method, using blood to lure the nearby underwater monsters. Although he didn't see any underwater monsters in his thermal vision, he knew that the city's drainage channels were interconnected. Even if some were blocked by collapsed roads, they were only a few. The range of the underwater monster's smell of blood in the water was far beyond the range of his thermal vision, so there was a great hope to attract the monsters. Seeing Dean's action, Aisha suddenly realized what he was planning. Her lips moved slightly, and she silently came behind Dean without saying anything. When the blood dyed the water red, Dean covered his wrist, controlled his heartbeat, and sucked the blood into his heart. The wound on his arm immediately stopped bleeding. He didn't forcefully burst out the blood in one breath, but slowly squeezed it out from his heart, which required stronger control. The squeezed blood slowly flowed throughout his body. Before it flowed to all the blood vessels in his arm, he pumped his heart again to suck the blood back so that the cycle was maintained. No more blood overflowed from the wound on his arm. Aisha saw Dean's action, and her eyes flashed. She whispered, "You have learned to stop bleeding on your own." Dean nodded slightly. As long as he learned to control and knew the principle of hemostasis, it was not difficult to do this. But in his current state of exhaustion, it was difficult to maintain such a state of heart control. More than 10 minutes later, the wound on his arm had been glued together after the bleeding had been stopped. Seeing this, Dean stopped controlling his heart and let it return to normal beating. At the same time, he took a breath. At this moment, a red-hot spot appeared in his thermal vision. It was swimming from 4 o'clock direction, and it seemed to be heading straight for the blood on the surface of the water. Dudian glanced at the concentration of the heat source. His heart was relieved. It was only at the level of a hunter, and the size was not big. It was less than 2 meters. For an underwater monster, it was considered small. "Coming," Aisha said. "Let me solve it. You take a rest." Dean said without looking back, "Let me do it. This kind of small thing doesn't need you to do it." Aisha looked at him, and her lips moved slightly. When she was about to say something, the underwater monster had already swam in front of them. It was less than 10 meters away. Dean's eyes flashed coldly. He put one hand into the water and swung at his bait. The underwater monster was like a giant shrimp. There was a curved barb on its tail and a row of sharp-boned spurs on its back. It looked more ferocious. At the moment it heard the sound of the water, it immediately jumped toward the entrance of the cave. Dean stared at the surface of the water. The moment it was about to pounce, he suddenly retracted his hand in the water. Puff! The giant shrimp-like monster suddenly jumped out of the water. It seemed to want to jump up and eat the bait. However, when it jumped out of the water, it immediately saw Dean and Aisha squatting on the shore. The blood-red eyes hidden deep in its carapace slightly shrank, and its body twisted to jump into the water. Dean suddenly made a move. The dagger went straight along its head, and, at the same time, his previously retracted hand clenched into a fist and hit the carapace under its abdomen. Bang! The monster was hammered into the ice wall opposite the puddle. Before it could slide, he quickly changed his fist into a claw, grabbed its body, and threw it into the ice cave behind him. Chapter 571. The giant prawn monster rolled into the ice cave. It screamed in pain and quickly climbed up. Its blood-red eyes were full of fear. It was about to jump toward the water where Dean was. Puff! Suddenly, the sound of the shell cracking was heard. The alloy boots stepped down and crushed the head of the giant prawn monster. Pale yellow brain matter gushed out, mixed with the broken shell, and splashed all over the ground. Aisha lifted her foot and took a step back. She stood in the same place as if nothing had happened. Dean was relieved. He came to the front of the dead giant prawn monster. He waved the dagger and skillfully cut the broken head from the body along the joints. He threw it to the two bone-biter rats curled up on the side. Then the dagger pierced through the incision. With a slight turn, the hard shell was cut open and quickly peeled off, revealing the bright red flesh inside and dark green blood vessels crisscrossing on the flesh. He skillfully removed the shell and pulled out the tendons. Soon, the edible parts of the giant prawn monster's body were decomposed. There was a total of 60 to 70 pounds of flesh. Aisha was sitting on the ice bed. She rested her chin on her hand as she quietly watched Dean busy himself. After the ingredients were ready, Dean drilled wood to make a fire. He ignited the fire and then cut the prepared giant prawn monster's flesh into thin pieces. He then broke off the spikes on its back carapace. He washed the spikes in the water and interspersed them with the thin pieces of flesh. He put them on the fire and barbecued them. Sizzle! The flame burned the thin pieces of flesh. Blood dripped from them and fell into the fire. At this time, the two bone-biter rats in the corner finally couldn't resist the temptation. They picked up the broken head of the giant prawn monster that Dean had thrown and gnawed hard, making squeaky sounds. It didn't take long for both sides of the thin pieces of flesh to be roasted. It exuded the smell of cooked seafood. It was extremely fragrant and tender. The color of the flesh was pink, and the edges were a little burnt. It looked even more tempting. Dean handed the first piece to Aisha and said, "You eat first." Aisha's eyes stayed on the thin piece of flesh for a moment. She immediately turned her eyes away and pushed Dean's arm back. "You eat first. You don't have much strength to control your heart. If you don't eat something to keep warm, your body will freeze." He gently bit the edge of the barbecue. It was as hot as he had imagined. He glanced at the ice bed where Aisha was sitting. He immediately got up and stuck a thin piece of meat on the corner of the ice bed. It made a sizzling sound. Aisha was puzzled. "What are you doing?" "Chill it." Dean laughed. When he felt that it was almost done, he immediately put the thin piece of flesh into his mouth. He felt that the texture was exceptionally good. It was very tender and smooth, and it was both cold and hot. It was simply refreshing. After he finished eating, he went back to the fire to roast the second piece. Aisha saw Dean swallow the thin piece of meat, and the corner of her mouth slightly moved. She stared at the second piece of meat in Dean's hand. Soon, the second piece was cooked. Dean handed it to her. Aisha didn't refuse again. She took it and felt the hot barbecue. She gently blew on it. She suddenly thought of Dean's previous method. She hesitated for a moment, but didn't follow his example. Otherwise, it would seem that she was too impatient. Dean took out the remaining spikes and inserted the thin piece of meat to continue roasting. In an instant, there was only the sound of gnawing and the sound of Aisha gently blowing on the barbecue. "It tastes good," Aisha said after eating. Dean said, "It's a pity that there is no salt seasoning. Otherwise, the taste would be better." Aisha didn't answer. She silently sat on the ice bed. Half an hour later, the firewood burned out. Dean and Aisha had eaten 7 or 8 kilograms of giant prawn monster's flesh. With the digestive power of their stomachs, their lower abdomen didn't swell even after eating 7 or 8 kilograms of meat. Dean felt that he was barely full. He guessed that with Aisha's physique, it was estimated that this amount of food was barely enough to make her not feel hungry. He immediately got up and said, "I'll go out and find some firewood." "No." Aisha reacted very quickly and immediately objected. "It's too dangerous outside. You can't go out alone. We are not hungry now. When we feel hungry, we will think of a way. Moreover, my wound is almost healed. It is estimated that in a few days, we will be able to leave here. At that time, we will go out together." Dean was startled. His eyes lit up. Your injury is almost healed? Aisha said, just the superficial wound is about to heal. But there are still a lot of toxins in the body. I can't do strenuous exercise. If I accelerate the blood flow, it is easy to spread the toxins faster. Dean immediately nodded and said, Okay, then I will think of a way in a few days. Aisha stared at Dean and said, This time, after my injury has healed and we return to the stronghold in the wasteland, you will stay here as a dragon guard. You should be safer this way. Dean was startled and looked at her with a puzzled look. The dragon guard guarded the wasteland and couldn't return to the giant wall all year round. It was far more dangerous than the dragon guard's job. Suddenly, he understood. This time his dragon guard squad was completely destroyed, but he survived alone. It was bound to attract Hathaway's attention. Moreover, Aisha had previously helped him apply for a magic weapon. This was tantamount to telling others that he had extraordinary potential. He was either a legendary magic mark warrior or a rare magic mark warrior who had hoped to enter the pioneer level. After all, a rare magic mark warrior would usually borrow the power of a magic weapon at the pioneer level. No matter which reason it was not a good thing for him. When he was still weak, he was used by Hathaway as a chess piece. If Hathaway knew that he had grown up enough to become Aisha's right-hand man, she would inevitably kill him and secretly frame him. I know, Duddy nodded. The only thing he could do now was to stay by Aisha's side. Moreover, if he lived outside the giant wall, he would have the opportunity to secretly make his own new invention and get away from the surveillance of the Dragon Clan. Aisha saw that Dean agreed, and a smile appeared on her face, saying, You can rest assured that I will arrange for you to be stationed in the stronghold. Generally, monsters will not attack there. Moreover, there are 8 generals. Even if monsters invade, there will be 8 generals to stay behind to kill them. There won't be any danger. Dean nodded. After resting for a while, he felt that his body temperature began to gradually drop. He immediately continued to control his heart and pump blood to keep warm. Chapter 572. 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. In the silent ice cave, Aisha looked at Dean, who was naked from the waist up and had a red complexion. She said with satisfaction, Very good. You can already control the flow of blood freely. It can be said that you have mastered the dragon blood technique. However, your heart muscle is not strong enough. If you practice more in the future, I believe that with your understanding, you will soon be able to reach the point where dragon blood bursts and beast blood boils. Dean only felt that his whole body was hot, as if he was being baked in the scorching heat. He was no longer cold. However, to maintain such a hot body temperature, the heart needed to breathe in and release at the same time. The so-called breathe in and release at the same time was to control the main blood vessels connected to the heart to carry out different tasks. On one hand, the blood was sucked in and out of the body, and on the other hand, the blood was sucked in and out of the body. This made the blood flow in the body maintain a circular whirlpool. The load on the heart was extremely high, no less than 500 beats per minute. With the current strength of his heart muscle, he could barely maintain this state for less than 10 minutes before feeling intense fatigue. But the effect of this was surprisingly obvious. First of all, his body temperature rose sharply. Even though he had the ice blood disease, he could still feel the strong heat. Second, the increase in strength. As Aisha said, the dragon blood technique was a secret technique to increase strength and fine-tune the body. Under the condition of blood circulation in the body, he felt that his whole body had endless strength. He seemed to be in the peak state of anger at all times. This point alone was enough to make the dragon blood technique a secret technique. It was the heart muscle that controlled the blood in the body. This meant that if a person was injured or physically weak, as long as he mastered the dragon blood technique, he could immediately return to his peak state. If he fought with an enemy of similar strength, he could use the dragon blood technique when his physical strength was almost exhausted, and then he could return to his peak state. Just this point alone was enough to completely crush those of the same cultivation level as him. If Aisha hadn't been poisoned, which happened to restrain the dragon blood technique, she wouldn't have fallen into such a difficult situation. After all, she had fought outside the giant wall for many years and encountered all kinds of monsters and dangers. She had relied on the counterattack effect of the dragon blood technique. Phew! Dean exhaled lightly. This time, he didn't persist to the limit of 10 minutes. He changed his heartbeat ahead of time and returned to the normal elongated breathing method to exercise the heart muscle and maintain body temperature at the same time to avoid exhaustion. According to Aisha, he was currently at the beginning stage. The dragon blood technique was divided into 3 stages. The first was the dragon blood vortex, which was his current stage. It could make the blood circulate in the body like a vortex with the heart as the core. This could stimulate the body's potential. Even if the strength was overdrawn, he could still recover to his peak state and continue fighting. However, if it was used for a long time, there would be sequelae in early life. Dean had thought about this for a long time. Although Aisha couldn't tell the reason for the exhaustion of vitality, but he knew that stimulating the blood to restore the body's function was only to accelerate the cell division. Everyone's cell division was limited. When a cell stopped dividing, it was the end of life. So how long a person could live depended on the toughness of the last cell division. The second stage of the dragon blood technique was beast blood boiling. It stimulated the blood of the whole body to collide with each other. In a short time, the oxygen and energy in the blood would be released greatly, and the body would enter the state of rage. It could greatly increase strength. When the blood collided with each other, the blood vessels would swell and oppress the pain nerves. It would lead to a temporary loss of pain, and the body would become a tyrant in human form. The third stage of the dragon blood technique was the dragon blood tide. Aisha had only briefly mentioned it to Dean, but didn't elaborate on it because even she herself hadn't reached this stage. The ice here is showing signs of melting. Aisha looked at the surrounding ice cave. Her eyes flickered with a hint of tenderness. She said softly, "It's time for us to leave." Dean glanced at her. "Are you ready?" "Yes." Aisha nodded slightly. Dean bent down to pick up the armor on the ground. He said, "Let's go. I'll lead the way." Aisha glanced at the 2 bone-biter rats in the corner. After 5 days of growth, the 2 bone-biter rats were nearly half the size of the original. They had been fed the shell and brain of the giant shrimp monster, which made them evolve quickly. Now they could be regarded as 2 rat kings. After 5 days of getting along, the 2 bone-biter rats were no longer afraid of Dean and Aisha. Seeing Aisha looking at them, they immediately squeaked as if to warn her. Dean smiled slightly. Seeing that they didn't kill them, these little things were getting more and more insatiable. He said to Aisha, "Should we roast them and eat them?" Aisha glanced at the 2 bone-biter rats and shook her head slightly. She said, "Forget it. Keep them." "Okay." Dean said to the 2 bone-biter rats, "Little guys, count yourselves lucky." After that, he held the dagger, put the remaining saltpeter, gauze, antidote powder, and other personal items into his backpack. Then he picked up the 2 shadow hunter eggs next to him and swam into the water. Aisha followed him to the entrance of the cave. She suddenly stopped and turned to look at the ice cave. Her eyes flickered slightly. She slowly retracted her gaze and jumped into the water. In the blink of an eye, Dean and Aisha came to the pool in the square and broke out of the water. Dean's wings stretched out from the gap made by the dagger behind the armor. He stood in the air and scanned the surrounding environment. When he didn't see any heat source, he was a little relieved. He knew that from the moment they left the ice cave, it meant that danger would appear at any time. Whoosh! Aisha jumped out of the water. Her feet stepped on the water surface as if she could use it as leverage. She jumped to the square on the shore, wrung her wet hair, and threw it behind her. She said to Dean, "Let's go." Dean nodded, landed, folded his wings, and said to Aisha, "Should we go to the Shadow Hunter's cave first?" "Yes." Aisha nodded. Dean immediately held the 2 eggs and led the way. The 2 Shadow Hunter eggs hadn't moved in the low temperature in the ice cave for 5 days. If they wanted to hatch, they needed to be in the same high-temperature environment as the underground nest. He walked along the street, familiar with the road, toward the mountain where the Shadow Hunter's cave was located. Chapter 573. From the desolate building, Dean found a familiar feeling. He walked along the edge of the street. Skeletons of dead monsters could be seen everywhere on the ground, as well as huge footprints covered with wet moss. In the 300 years of disaster, this soil had been baptized by too many monsters, and it had long been muddy. After walking for 4 or 5 miles, Aisha suddenly said, "Change the road. There are monsters ahead." "Okay." Dean immediately changed the route. Although Aisha's wounds had only healed and her strength had not yet recovered, the perception ability of her body organs was not something he could match. After taking a long detour, the two continued to move forward. Along the way, with Aisha's reminder, Dean did not encounter any dangerous high-level monsters. As for some dense, ordinary undeads and small monsters, he could kill them easily, and there was no need to hide. Half an hour later, the two came to the Shadow Hunter's cave. "Someone has been here." Dean's face changed slightly when he saw the footprints left in front of the cave. He stepped forward and carefully examined it. He found that the number of footprints was messy. From the depth of the footprints, there were a total of 7 people. This was the number of people in the Dragon Guard squad. "It's the footprints of the Dragon Guard." Aisha glanced at it and looked into the cave, saying, "It's probably the exploration team that came with me to find the Wing Clan's Parna. They found this place and asked the Dragon Guard to transplant the eggs inside. Let's go in and have a look." "The Dragon Guard?" Dean was surprised. "How do you know?" "I recognize the lines on the soles of the boots," Aisha said and walked into the cave. Dean woke up. He didn't expect that the lines on the soles of the boots could also be her means of identification. He felt that he had learned another trick. After entering the cave, Dean noticed that the footprints led to the depths of the cave. He couldn't help but feel a little regretful. He thought he could steal a few more eggs for collection, but now it seemed that they had all been handed over. This time, with so many legendary monsters' eggs, the Dragon Clan should be able to cultivate a lot of strong people, right? Dean said, "It should not be the first time something like this has happened in the wasteland for so many years." "So, the Dragon Clan's pioneers all have legendary magic marks?" Aisha shook her head slightly and said, "The reason why legendary magic marks are called legendary magic marks is that the number of people with legendary magic marks is extremely small. It doesn't mean that one can get legendary magic marks by getting legendary parasitic soulworm." "What do you mean?" Dean was puzzled. The absorption of a legendary parasitic soulworm is different from that of other parasitic soulworms. The host can easily be devoured by the parasitic soulworm and become an insect man. Aisha turned to look at him. "You live outside the giant wall, so your information is limited. The highest level outside the giant wall is hunter level, so you don't know that there are conditions for magic marks replacement. Not everyone can replace magic marks." Dean was startled. He suddenly remembered the time when he absorbed the Splitter's parasitic soulworm. At that time, the parasitic soulworm drilled into his body and desperately drilled into his head. Fortunately, he pinched his neck so that the Splitter's parasitic soulworm couldn't find a place to rest. Only then did it reside in the magic mark nest on his chest. It seemed that if it had drilled into his brain at that time, he would have most likely become the insect man that Aisha had mentioned. Although he didn't know what the bugmen looked like, just the name alone made him feel nauseous. "There are conditions for magic mark replacement." Dean looked at her with a hint of asking for advice. He knew that the information in this world was blocked by layers of barriers. It was difficult to get complete information with his previous identity, and even false information. "Yes," Aisha said. "You also know that the higher the physique, the more parts of the body will transform. This is caused by the magic marks. If you rashly replace the magic marks when there are too many beastified parts, then it will be very difficult for the body that has already been transformed to accept the transformation of the new magic marks. It may even conflict with each other and cause unpredictable consequences. The most serious possibility is death. And if you're a little bit lucky, your consciousness will collapse your body will swell, and you will become a strange and ugly, inhuman, bloodthirsty monster. So, if the physique is too high, the magic marks will be fixed and can't be replaced. Aisha turned to look at Dean and said, "You are very lucky to get legendary magic marks at the hunter stage. Generally speaking, even if you evolve to the senior hunter stage, the risk of magic mark replacement is only about 20%. Unless you are very unlucky, most people will be fine." Dean was startled. "So, even if we get a lot of these shadow hunter eggs, we can only give them to the potential newcomers in the family. As for those who have already become frontiersmen and pioneer, their magic marks have been fixed, so they can't use them." Aisha said, "And the problem is here. Although the resistance of the magic marks is less when replacing the new hunter with the legendary magic marks, so there won't be any danger. The legendary parasitic soul worm itself is very dangerous. It can't be subdued by ordinary hunters. Even the elite hunters specially cultivated by our dragon family with extraordinary willpower will be eroded by the legendary parasitic soul worm and become an insect man. So, even if we get dozens of legendary insect eggs this time, it will be good if only 1/10 of them can become legendary magic marks. And among the people branded with legendary magic marks, there are very few who can live to the pioneer level." Dean was secretly surprised. He didn't expect that absorbing the legendary magic marks was so dangerous. Even the elite hunters, specially cultivated by the dragon family, had such a high failure rate. If it was an ordinary person, wouldn't the legendary parasitic soul worm become a poison? If it becomes an insect man, what will happen? Dean asked. Aisha narrowed her eyes slightly and said, "Will be dealt with." Dean knew that it was true. Aisha slowed down a little and walked side by side with Dean. She looked at him and said, "I see that you have a lot of scars on your body. Have you experienced a lot of hardships before?" Dean suddenly thought of the things in the prison. His eyes flashed slightly and said, "It's okay. It's all over. But according to what you said, I really have to thank these hardships for tempering my willpower. Otherwise, I would have died when I got the splitter parasitic soul worm. When we experience pain, we hate the pain. When the pain is over, we thank the pain," Aisha said slowly. Dean looked at her and nodded slightly. "Yes. Here we are." Aisha walked briskly and came to the collapsed cave in front of the hole in the ground. She looked inside and said, "Sure enough, it's all gone. Only the traces of the egg pit are left." Dean squatted and looked at the hole. Indeed, as Aisha said, the original hot nest was empty, and the once dense eggs were all gone. They have probably been moved to the stronghold. Aisha retracted her gaze and looked at Dean. "Unfortunately, you are already a frontiersman. Otherwise, with your willpower, you can definitely replace the magic mark with a shadow hunter magic mark. You can also further deify the magic mark and make it a legendary deified magic mark. Your future potential will reach the point where it is second only to me. In this case, I will recommend you to the family. You will definitely get a lot of resources." Speaking of this, there was a trace of sigh in her eyes. Dean's heart moved. "You have a legendary deified magic mark." He almost said the word, "also." Aisha grunted. "My magic mark has been prepared since I was born. It is the third of the 8 legendary monsters, the Dragon Warrior. This is the legendary monster that our Dragon Clan's ancestors once subdued. It is also the magic mark passed down from generation to generation in our Dragon Clan." Dean was stunned. Passed down from generation to generation? Doesn't this mean that the Dragon Clan has a lot of parasitic soul worms of the Dragon Warrior? Does it mean that the Dragon Clan have a lot of parasitic soul worms? However, what surprised him even more was that legendary monsters actually have a ranking. Seeing Dean's expression, Aisha seemed to know what he was thinking. She smiled and said, "All the creatures in this world have strong and weak ones, even the same type of monster. Legendary monsters are no exception. Like this shadow hunter, it is ranked 7th among the 8 legendary monsters. Although its stealth ability is first class, if its camouflage ability is seen through, its frontal ability is only slightly stronger than rare monsters." "What about the splitter?" Dean asked. Aisha smiled and said, "The Splitter is an extreme attack type monster. Is ranked 4th. Is a very rare legendary monster." Dean was slightly startled. He was a little lost in his heart, but thinking that it was not at the bottom, he was somewhat comforted. He suddenly thought of something and couldn't help but ask, "Wing Clan and Rock Clan, are they the same as you?" "They have legendary magic marks passed down from generation to generation." "Are their legendary magic marks ranked 1st and 2nd? "Of course not." Aisha smiled and said, "It is true that there are legendary magic marks passed down from generation to generation. Otherwise, once the generations are cut off, it is equivalent to destruction. However, their legendary magic marks are far from comparable to our Dragon Clan. The legendary magic mark passed down from generation to generation in the Wing Clan is the Bat Whisper, which is ranked 5th. That's why we call them the evangelists of the Wall Lord's ears. They always like to snitch in front of the Wall Lord. The legendary magic mark of the Rock Clan is ranked 6th, which is above the Shadow Hunter. So, your Splitter magic mark is better than the magic marks of the Wing Clan and the Rock Clan. But their magic marks are deified. Under the stimulation of deification, it is enough to make up for the gap of 1 or 2 ranks. Especially the magic marks below the top 3, the gap is not big." Dean was startled. He didn't expect that the magic mark of the Splitter he accidentally got was better than the magic mark of 2 of the 3 families in the inner wall. This meant that his growth potential could surpass them. If combined with the new divine ability, even if it had the bloodline power, it was enough to wipe out or even surpass them. However, this kind of ranking is not absolute. Aisha said, "Every legendary monster has its best field, terrain, and environment. They won't easily leave the environment they are good at. Once other legendary monsters enter the environment they are good at, they will inevitably fall into a disadvantageous position or even be killed. Sometimes, even the Shadow Hunter, which is ranked 7th, can kill the Splitter and the Bat Whisperer. However, this kind of actual ranking that is affected by other factors doesn't have much impact on the top 3 legendary monsters." Aisha whispered, "Although they're known as the 8 legendary monsters, the gap between the top 3 legendary monsters is getting bigger and bigger. Especially the first legendary monster, Dream Breeder, which is almost beyond the scope of legendary monsters. No matter what environment it is in, it can easily kill other legendary monsters. Even Legendary Hunter may be killed by it." "So strong?" Dean was surprised. Aisha nodded slightly. "This is what I heard from Grandmother Dragon Mother. I haven't seen it with my own eyes. The trace of Dream Breeder hasn't appeared for hundreds of years. The most recent appearance was also 100 years ago. At that time, only footprints were left. The Saintess of that generation couldn't find it, so it was left unsettled. But it is certain that no one has the magic mark of Dream Breeder, so we can just take it as a legend and listen to it." Dean's eyes flashed slightly. There was some desire in his heart, the desire for power. However, as Aisha said, it was fine to listen to it as a story. Not to mention the Dream Breeder. Even other legendary monsters were rare. "Let's find a place to rest," Aisha said. Dean nodded. The two went out of the cave. Dean found the place where Ruby hid the bag, but he didn't see the bag. Instead, there were a few footprints in front of the cave. Obviously, the bag of food was taken away by those dragon guards. He smiled bitterly and took Aisha to the desolate neighborhood. They found a relatively dilapidated building and went in. They spread branches and vines on the ground as a bed. Now that Aisha's strength had not recovered, she could only continue to live in this orange wasteland. In the following days, Dean and Aisha went out to hunt together every day. With Aisha's super perception, the two didn't encounter any high-level monsters. However, this was also related to the range and time of each hunting. They didn't hunt in a large area, and each time they went out for a short time. After hunting the small monsters, they quickly returned to their hiding place. After eating and drinking in the residence, Dean exercised his heart muscle. Aisha had nothing to do, so she taught Dean a complete set of Dragon Thorn, which was the secret skill that Dean had previously been accused of stealing. In Aisha's words, teaching Dragon Blood technique had already violated the rules, so it didn't matter to do it one more time. Time flew. In the blink of an eye, Dean and Aisha had lived in the Orange Wasteland for more than half a month, which didn't include the unknown time they lived in the ice cave. Have you packed everything? Aisha stood outside the gate of the dilapidated ruins with only the blood-red sword on her back. She turned her head and looked at Dean, who was packing inside. Chapter 574. Aisha glanced at the animal clothes that Dean put into the backpack. Her eyes flashed slightly, but she didn't say anything. After Dean came to her side, she whispered, "Hold on to me. Let's fly back." "Fly back?" Dean said, "Your injury has just healed. Is it okay to fly so far?" "It's okay." Aisha raised her hand to hold the blood-red sword on her back. Her fingers slightly twisted the hilt, and a bloody light suddenly splashed out. The blood-red sword slowly dissolved in the bandage and turned into flowing blood, adhering to her back. The blood emerged and gradually outlined a pair of extremely huge wings, flashing with demonic bloody light. Whoosh! The bloody light converged, and the wings revealed their true appearance. It was a pair of huge dark red wings, more than 10 meters long and extremely vast. When it was stretched out, the wind rolled the sand and stones on the ground, making bursts of whistling sound. Dean was shocked. Was this the legendary magic weapon? Even the genetic weapons he knew didn't seem to have such power. Moreover, it could change automatically without connecting to her nerves. It was incredible. "Are you ready?" Aisha tilted her head and asked Dean. Dean reacted and was about to reach out to grab her. When his palms stretched out, he suddenly didn't know where to grab. Aisha saw Dean's embarrassment and was slightly startled. There was a trace of softness in her eyes, but she quickly restored her calmness. She stretched out her hand and clasped Dean's wrist to her waist, saying, "Take off." Whoosh! After that, without waiting for Dean's response, the bloody dark red wings suddenly flapped, and the ground seemed to suddenly roll up a level 10 hurricane, flying sand and stones, splashing countless dust. But Aisha and Dean's body still soared high in the sky, as if launched from the ground. Dean only felt the wind whistling in his ears, and the scenery in his sight quickly pulled away. In the blink of an eye, he rose from the ground to the sky hundreds of meters high. Things on the street under his feet came into view, and he could overlook the scenery of the entire desolate neighborhood. So fast, Dean was shocked. This flying speed was something that he could never hope to achieve. No wonder she was able to climb over the side wall when she was 8 or 9 years old. A faint fragrance floated from the tip of his nose. Dean glanced at it, and his heart beat slightly faster. At this moment, their posture was a bit too close. His body was almost completely hanging on Aisha's body, and his hands were tightly holding her waist. Her armor was not cold metal, but similar to a rubber and fiber material. This also caused her exquisite figure to be fully displayed. His head happened to be under her shoulder, and from the corner of his eye, he could see her full breasts. He felt a trace of restlessness in his blood, and his heart thumped uncontrollably. But soon, he remembered that the girl in his arms had saved his life several times. This kindness was difficult to repay. The distracting thoughts in his mind immediately cooled down, and he felt a trace of shame. He shifted his line of sight to another place, and he was surprised to find that the desolate street below him was like a blurry afterimage that flashed by quickly. If he was running on the ground at such a speed, it would simply be unheard of. Is this her real strength? Dean's eyes moved to Aisha's face, but her expression was very calm. Aisha looked forward, holding Dean with one hand to prevent him from falling. At the same time, there was a trace of nervousness in her heart. Since Dean hugged her, the picture of them hugging each other in the dark ice cave suddenly appeared in her mind. This picture lingered in her mind and repeatedly appeared. She felt her cheeks were hot, and there was a feeling of redness. But thinking that Dean would notice her abnormality, she immediately controlled her heart to change the blood flow, reducing the blood flow in her face so that her expression remained calm. At this time, she noticed that Dean was looking up at her. Her heart tightened, and she pretended to casually bow her head, saying, "Is there any discomfort?" Dean saw her looking at him, and his expression and tone were extremely calm. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable sense of loss in his heart. A self-deprecating thought emerged in his mind. Dean, you are really too dirty. I have no reaction to a girl, and you actually think of some messy and unrealistic things." Thinking of this, his expression returned to calmness, and he shook his head. "Nothing." Aisha noticed the change in Dean's expression, and a trace of doubt flashed in her eyes. But she did not ask, and could only be silent. Whoosh, whoosh. The whistling sound of the wind brushed past their ears. Along the way, the two of them flew in silence. Desolate streets, mountains, suburban swamps, and other ground scenery passed quickly under their feet, like a fleeting phantom. Only the gray clouds in the sky were always lingering, as if there was no end. "We are entering the Red Wasteland." After flying for half an hour, Aisha said. Dean woke up from the silence and looked forward. His eyes could not help but reveal a trace of surprise. Although he had heard from Ian and others that the terrain of the Red Wasteland and the Orange Wasteland did not change much, he could feel the gap in the middle at this moment. In the Orange Wasteland, they could still vaguely see the outline of the dilapidated old buildings on the ground, including the streets and gravel. It could still be seen that this was a ruined city. However, a few thousand meters ahead, there were a few craters that were dozens of meters in diameter on the ground. They looked like deep craters caused by meteorites. The surroundings were full of rubble, but there was no sign of any buildings. All the ruined buildings had been razed to the ground. Whoosh! Bloody dragon wings swept across the sky. Aisha and Dean quickly flew to this messy area. Dean suddenly saw that in front of this messy area, the ground was even more dilapidated. There were deep pits and cracks everywhere. There were few huge trees and dense vines on the ground. Obviously, something had passed through here for a long time. This was still a ruined city, but there was no shadow of the city. Only from the broken stones piled up, a little bit of the location of the former buildings could be seen. Aisha looked down in front of her, and there was a trace of seriousness in her eyes. After they entered the Red Wasteland for more than 10 minutes, suddenly, from the ground, a shadow jumped out of the gravel gap, just in front of them, as if it had calculated Aisha's flying speed. Roar! Chapter 575. Six-Eyed Spider. Dean was startled by the monster that suddenly jumped up. After seeing its appearance, his face suddenly changed. This was a level 65 monster. Looking at its size, it had obviously reached the mature stage. Aisha's eyes were slightly cold. She suddenly threw the dagger backhandedly. Whoosh! The hilt of the dagger was facing outwards, and its speed was extremely fast. It directly collided with the green spider web that the six-eyed magic spider had spat out. In the next moment, the green spider web suddenly fell down and actually pounced towards the six-eyed magic spider. The giant mouth on the back of the six-eyed spider issued a sharp cry. Its body suddenly turned sideways. It wanted to dodge, but its speed was too slow. It was immediately covered by the green spider web, and even the dagger hit its back. Aisha's body suddenly sank. She raised her leg high and lashed down like an angry whip. Bang! The head of the six-eyed spider was flung by the leg. Its skull suddenly caved in, and it fell straight down like a meteorite. With a bang, it fiercely smashed into the gravel on the ground, raising countless dust clouds. Aisha glanced at it. She didn't stop, nor did she have the thought of picking up the dagger. She continued to fly forward. Dean was shocked. He didn't expect that a level 65 monster would be dealt with by her in the blink of an eye. Although he couldn't see the situation inside because of the dust clouds, he knew that falling from a height of 200 or 300 meters, coupled with the strength of Aisha's leg whip, even if it was strong, the bones of the whole body would be broken. This six-eyed spider should be very hungry. That's why it took the risk to hunt for food in the air. Dean thought in his heart. He had read the information about the six-eyed spider in the high-level monster atlas that Ian had given him. It was a kind of amphibious monster. It mainly lived on the ground, but it could also live in the water for several weeks. Moreover, it had a mouth under its abdomen. It could breathe in air at one time and use it as a propulsion force to soar into the sky. However, the role of this propulsion force was to fly. It was very slow to change the direction freely. That's why he didn't dodge in time when he was reflected by the spiderweb. Dean couldn't help but admire Aisha. She was able to think of such a method in a flash. She used the blunt dagger handle to hit the resilient cobweb and drove the cobweb to counterattack, giving her a taste of her own medicine. Apart from pure strength, the gap between me and her in combat experience and adaptability is too big, Dean secretly thought. He secretly decided that he had to seize the time to practice his fighting skills while making the new invention. Although he could rely on the new invention to protect himself, but to defeat the top powerhouses of the inner wall, he still needed his own strength. Whoosh! As he continued to fly, Dean overlooked the scenery of the red wasteland from the sky. The ruins on the ground were everywhere, and there were few intact lands. Compared with the ruins of the city in the orange wasteland, this place was completely barren. After 7 or 8 minutes, a boulder was thrown from the ground towards Dean and Aisha. Aisha's eyes flickered. Her dragon wings flapped, and her body swayed to avoid the fierce, whistling boulder. Dean looked at the ground and saw a 7 or 8 meters tall gorilla-shaped monster standing in the ruins. Its body was covered with thick black hair. There were several curved, giant horns on the top of its head and 2 arms on its back. It was the Herculean ape, a level 62 existence. Whoosh! The dragon wings crossed the sky and flew straight forward. In the blink of an eye, the Herculean ape was left behind until it disappeared. Dean felt cold sweat oozing from his forehead. If he had flown before, it would have been difficult for him to react and avoid the boulder. As Aisha said before, flying in the red wasteland was indeed an extremely dangerous thing. He turned his eyes slightly and suggested a high shot. Should we fly a little higher to avoid being attacked by these land monsters? Aisha looked up at the dark sky and said, "It's more dangerous up there." More dangerous? Above the clouds is the place where the thunderbirds rest. Aisha said slowly, "Thunderbirds usually live in groups. Even I can only avoid them if I attract their attention." Dean was startled. He couldn't help but look up at the gray clouds above his head. He felt a chill in his heart. The wilderness outside the giant wall was really full of danger. Whoosh! The wind whistled as Aisha vigorously flapped her dragon wings and flew straight forward. Half an hour later, Aisha whispered, "In front of us is the edge of the red wasteland number 1. The place closest to the black wasteland is also the base camp of our dragon clan in the wasteland." Dean followed her gaze. The desolate black soil in his sight was getting closer. Soon, he saw a fortress similar to an ancient city. It was surrounded by a high ring-shaped wall, about 100 meters high. There were several observation towers and residential buildings inside the wall. This is the stronghold of the dragon clan. Whoosh! Aisha's figure obscured the light and flew at a high speed. In the blink of an eye, she came to the sky above the fortress and landed like a horrible shadow. Soldiers wearing strange armors were stationed around the high walls of the fortress. The armors were engraved with dragon patterns. Most of them were the dragon guards. Saintess? Several guards were surprised to see Aisha. They quickly stepped forward and bowed. "Greetings, Saintess." The news that Aisha's Saintess status had been removed hadn't spread to the wasteland yet. Therefore, they still called Aisha as Saintess. "Where are the 8 generals?" Aisha put away her dragon wings, and her expression became indifferent. Seeing this, Dean immediately withdrew his hand from her waist and quietly stood beside her. Aisha's eyes moved and looked at Dean. There was a trace of softness in her eyes. But when she looked at the attendants in front of her, her indifference was restored. "Saintess, which 8 generals are you looking for?" a servant courageously asked. Aisha narrowed her eyes and didn't say anything. She turned around and walked to the edge of the fortress. She stepped forward and stepped on the air. Her body fell straight down. Her knees slightly bent as she landed. She immediately dissolved the downward force and landed smoothly. Only 2 deep footprints were left on the ground. She stepped forward. Dean followed her and jumped down from the fortress, but he didn't land as naturally as her. His feet stepped on the fortress to cushion the impact, and then he did a somersault in the air to resolve the impact. Saintess. Greetings, Saintess. The soldiers saw Aisha and quickly bowed their heads to salute. At the same time, they secretly looked at Dean, who was behind Aisha. When they saw the standard armor on Dean's body, there was a trace of understanding in their hearts. Chapter 576. All of them are at the limitless level. Dean observed the heat source reaction of these soldiers through thermal vision. The result surprised him. He didn't expect these seemingly ordinary soldiers to have such strong strength. Could it be that the most ordinary existence here was the Dragon Guard? After Aisha passed by, the soldiers raised their heads and saw Dean looking at them. They slightly raised their heads and grinned at him. There was a playful smile on their lips, with a bit of provocation and contempt. Dean's expression was as usual. His eyes swept over their faces without the slightest change. Aisha walked along the street, passing by buildings along the way. When passing by one of the buildings, Dean immediately heard bursts of women's sobbing and some men's laughter coming from the building. He turned his head and looked. Using thermal vision, he saw that there were a lot of heat sources in this building. Some of them were weak. They seemed to be ordinary primary hunters. Judging from their figures, they seemed to be women. What's this? Dean retracted his gaze and asked Aisha in confusion. Aisha looked at him and squinted. Are you also interested? Dean was startled and coughed lightly. How come? I just want to ask. How can there be such a place here? Aisha deeply looked at him, and her expression returned to normal. She looked straight at the road ahead and said, The Dragon Guard has been living in the wasteland for a long time, far away from home and the protection of the giant wall. They live a precarious life. If there is no entertainment, they will go crazy. Dean's eyes moved slightly. He suddenly thought of the things in the Thornflower prison. When people were imprisoned in the cage, they would be abnormal. If the giant wall was a cage, then these people who lived outside the wall should be free and happy. But the reality was not like this. If the cage birds escaped from the cage, they would perish. What was the real cage? Dean's thoughts slowly drifted away. He couldn't see the buildings on both sides of the street until a voice came from the front. Your Highness Saintess, you are finally back. We were worried to death. The one who spoke was a young male voice. Dean looked up and saw a handsome young man standing in front of Aisha. He was tall and thin with bright blonde hair. He was wearing a soft white robe and had an elegant temperament. The only flaw was that there was a long and narrow scar on his cheek. It was like a crack on a fine porcelain. It was a pity. How long have I been gone? Aisha asked. The handsome young man was slightly surprised and immediately said, It has been more than 40 days since I left last time. Dean was surprised. The last time Aisha left was to kill Parna in the Orange Wasteland, and then she met him. So they had been together for more than a month, and he had also been in the Wasteland for more than a month. Aisha narrowed her eyes and said in her heart, It's been so long. Her ceremony should be over. She quickly took back her thoughts and thought of something. She turned to Dean and said, This is Eureka, one of the 8 generals. He's also my friend. Eureka, this is my friend, Dean. I hope you can take care of him in the future. There was a flash of surprise in Eureka's eyes. He noticed Dean behind Aisha when she came from afar. He thought he was just a victim Aisha picked up when she went to the Orange Wasteland. He didn't expect him to be her friend. He had been in the Wasteland for so many years and knew Aisha's character very well. Although this girl was very strong, her EQ was very average. She had always been a loner, didn't like to talk much, and didn't like to go to crowded places, so she had very few friends. He didn't expect that this little dragon guard could be a friend of a dignified saintess. It was incredible. He looked up and down at Dean, but still couldn't see anything special about him. He was too mediocre. However, since he could become friends with Aisha, he must have some hidden extraordinary ability or some special reasons. Thinking of this, a smile appeared on his face. He stretched out his hand and said, "Hello, nice to meet you. If there's anything I can help you in the future, don't hesitate to ask me." Dean nodded slightly and shook hands with him. A friend of a friend was not necessarily a friend. He only recognized Aisha here. Seeing Dean was serious, Eureka raised his eyebrows slightly. He suddenly understood that this person's character seemed to be not much different from Aisha's. They were both taciturn guys. It could be said that birds of a feather flock together. "Are you the only one in the fortress? Where are the others?" Aisha asked. Eureka smiled and said, "Amy and Gabby are out on a mission. The others are also busy with their own things. I'm a little free, so I came to find you." Aisha frowned slightly and said, "Has the fortress been attacked during this time?" "Twice. It was a little guy who sneaked in, and we killed him." Eureka glanced at her and said, "What about you? You've been back for so long. Did you encounter something difficult? You went out last time to kill the Wing Clan invaders who smuggled in. With the skills of the Wing Clan, even their holy son may not be your opponent. Did you encounter a monster?" Aisha nodded slightly. "I met a legendary hunter." "Legendary hunter?" Eureka was surprised and couldn't help but ask, "What happened? Are you all right?" "I'm fine." Aisha shook her head slightly. "I was injured. I'm recuperating outside." Then she walked forward. In front of her was a castle with hundreds of steps. It was extremely tall and majestic. Eureka immediately followed and said, "Are you all right? I'll find someone to treat you right away. I've recovered. Let's see it again. It's not good if there are any sequelae." "Okay, well, I'll call the doctor right away." Eureka immediately turned and ran. When he passed by Dean, he glanced at him and nodded slightly. Dean also nodded slightly. After Eureka left, he frowned slightly. He always felt that Eureka was a bit unpleasant to the eye. Aisha didn't look back, but seemed to notice Dean's expression and said, "What's wrong?" Dean's eyebrows loosened and he shook his head. "Nothing." A glimmer of light flashed in Aisha's eyes. She smiled faintly and said, "You don't seem very happy." "No." Dean immediately denied and changed the topic. "There should be a lot of monsters at the border of the Red Wasteland. Isn't it easy to be attacked by monsters when building such a big target as the fortress?" Chapter 577. When he came to the majestic fortress, Dean saw that there was no one inside. It was extraordinarily quiet. There was not a single maid or squire. The tall pillars supported the entire dome of the fortress. The cold wind poured in from the outside of the pillars, howling as if it was wailing. "This is where you live." Dean was a little stunned. He could vaguely see the beds, weapon racks for hanging swords, and the training field. But apart from that, there was no decoration. It was cold and lonely. Aisha didn't deny or admit it. She turned to Dean and said, "I will apply to the clan to make a magic weapon for you, but I need to extract part of the magic mark in your body. The medical equipment here is relatively backward. It may take some time to prepare. You should rest for 2 days and prepare for the operation." "Okay." Dean nodded and glanced at her thin figure. He whispered, "When my magic weapon is made, I will help you." Aisha was startled. Her eyes softened a lot. She whispered, "Okay." As if it was an agreement, the cold wind swept past them, bringing a trace of warmth. After a long time, Eureka ran up the steps. When he saw the 2 people in the training field, his eyes flickered slightly. He immediately rushed over and said to Aisha, "Your Royal Highness, the doctor is here." Aisha turned her head, and her eyes fell on the steps behind him. A graceful figure jumped up from there. She was wearing a white coat and slender silver alloy high-heeled boots. Her snow-white legs were covered with black stockings that extended to the depths of her skirt. She was dressed very coldly and wore a pair of black, thick-rimmed glasses. She walked over step by step. "Your Royal Highness, you are finally back," the woman said to Aisha with a faint expression. Aisha smiled. "Fanny, you are here. It's because of you," Fanny said indifferently. I don't know where you disappeared these days. There were heavy casualties here. The clan had to send me to the front line. What 8 generals? They're more like 8 wastes. Eureka looked embarrassed and said, Fanny, we can't deal with monsters of that level at all. It's good that we can resist them. Fanny glanced at him. Don't find excuses for wastes. Eureka paused and smiled bitterly. Dean stopped his exercise and turned to look at the woman curiously. There was a trace of surprise in his heart. This kind of tone and attitude was a bit like the venomous tongue he had when he first met Haisha. Aisha frowned. Does the clan know about me? Isn't that obvious? Fanny shrugged and said, You're our holy maiden. You've been missing for so long, and those old geezers in our family are already worried sick. Look, the family has already sent that good little sister of yours here. Didn't you see her? Aisha and Dean were startled. Dean's pupil shrank. Was Hathaway here? Aisha turned her head and said to Eureka, My sister is here too? Why didn't you tell me before? Eureka said, Your Highness, you just came back. I was going to report to you later. Aisha's face was gloomy as she remained silent. Fanny replied in an indifferent manner, What difference does it make whether I say it or not? Are you scared of her? Aisha frowned and said, It's not as simple as you think. Dean glanced at her and knew that she was worried about him. If Hathaway also came to the fortress, she would inevitably find trouble with him. Now he was walking into a trap. He immediately said, How about I leave here? Hearing his words, Fanny's eyes moved and fell on Dean. A trace of surprise flashed in her eyes. She looked up and down, frowned, and said to Aisha, This kid is my friend, Aisha said. Fanny narrowed her eyes and turned to look at Dean and said, Dragon Guard? Kid, you're the one who caused little Lisa to lose her holy maiden status. I didn't expect you to have the face to appear here. Dean's face changed slightly. Fanny. Aisha was slightly angry. Fanny was slightly startled. She didn't expect that Aisha would be angry with her, and it was because of someone else. She couldn't help but look at Dean again, and her brows slowly wrinkled and said, Are you worried that your sister will use him to deal with you? How do you know that this kid isn't your sister's man? Maybe he has been colluding with your sister for a long time. Even if you can be sure that he isn't your sister's man, you should also understand that anyone who gets close to you will become a disaster for you. Aisha bit her lip and said, Don't say any more. He has nothing to do with Hathaway. Dean wanted to leave, but after hearing her last sentence, he couldn't help but clench his fists and look up at her. Fanny noticed Dean's gaze and snorted coldly and said, What? You're not convinced? If you're really little Lisa's friend, you'd better leave her immediately. Otherwise, you will harm her. Do you know how powerful her sister is? If you want to die, no one will care about you, but don't involve little Lisa. Shut up. Aisha glared at her and said, Don't say any more. Fanny was startled and gritted her teeth and said, If you want to protect him, then let him leave you, or you will regret it. I have a sense of propriety in this matter. Aisha took a deep breath and said, This is my territory. No one can hurt my people. Fanny looked at her deeply and said, You're on your own. I didn't come here today to quarrel with you. You took so long to come back, so you should be injured. Let me give you a diagnosis first. Aisha glanced at her and nodded slightly. Fanny glanced at Eureka and Dean next to her and said, Do you two gentlemen know to give way? Eureka smiled bitterly and said, Okay, I'll go now. Aisha said to Dean, You go with Eureka. He will arrange a residence for you. Here, Hathaway won't dare to touch you otherwise. I won't let her leave alive. Fanny and Eureka were startled. Both of them looked at Aisha incredulously. They never thought that she would go to this point for this boy. Hathaway had offended and hurt her countless times, and she had endured it all. She didn't fight back even once. But this time, she was willing to kill her sister for this boy. Both of them suddenly found that they had greatly underestimated this boy's position in Aisha's heart. Dean looked at Aisha in a daze, and an indescribable, complex feeling suddenly welled up in his heart. He was a little surprised, a little shocked, and a little scared. He slightly clenched his fists and nodded and said, I won't let her use me again. Chapter 578. Have you forgotten the lesson from before? Fanny said to Aisha after Dudeen left. Your sister isn't like others. She knows how to be grateful. What she wants is not just an identity, but absolute power. As long as you exist, you will be her enemy and her obstacle. She won't be soft-hearted. Sooner or later, it will be a problem if you keep him by your side. Aisha turned to the bedside and sat down. If I let him go, where can he go? Fanny was startled. If he goes back to the wall, it will be more dangerous for him to be alone. Aisha said, many people in the family have pledged allegiance to Hathaway, and they are worried about the opportunity to make meritorious contributions. He is an orphan and has no one to rely on. He has been homeless for a long time. Only here, he has a glimmer of hope for survival. Orphan? Fanny was slightly taken aback. She then looked at her and fell silent. After a long while, she said, he has no background, no power, and nothing at all. He can only blame himself for coming into contact with a world that he doesn't deserve to come into contact with. A person like him can only live in the mud. That's where he belongs. You shouldn't have forced him out. Even though he'll be able to breathe fresh air, the price is his life. If he's here, I can protect him. Aisha tilted her head and looked at her. Moreover, don't underestimate him. If you were him, you might not be able to reach the point he is today. Moreover, he has legendary magic marks. Legendary magic marks? Fanny was shocked. This kid has legendary magic marks? Aisha smiled. Isn't it amazing? As far as I know, this kid is from the outer wall. He is an orphan and has no one to rely on. How could he have legendary magic marks? Fanny was shocked. Even if he was lucky enough to get legendary parasitic soulworm, but without professional training, how could he withstand the erosion of legendary parasitic soulworm? So, don't underestimate him. Aisha smiled. I believe that one day, he will soar above the real sky. Fanny stared at her blankly for a long time before she slowly came back to her senses. The shock on her face had also gradually subsided. She shook her head slightly and said, even a legendary magic mark is futile. If your sister finds out, he will definitely die. Not to mention that he hasn't grown up yet. Even if he did, he would only be an excellent legendary pioneer. But there are plenty of such people in our family. Besides, he doesn't have the bloodline power or the secret skills that he has learned since he was young. Compare with other legendary pioneers in our family who have been practicing secret skills since they were young. He is much weaker. Aisha smiled and shook her head. She didn't say anything. She didn't tell Fanny that Dean had learned the first stage of the extremely difficult dragon blood technique in less than half a month. One must know that even she, who was hailed as a rare genius in 100 years, had spent an entire month to master the first stage. The difference is too great. Fanny sighed and said, it's a pity. If he hadn't been related to you, he could have become a character. But your status is too high. You and him are like a bird and a fish. Even if he is transformed, he is still a fish after all. At most, he can dominate the deep water, but he can't leap into the sky. Aisha said softly, if so, then I am willing to land in the water. Fanny was stunned and looked at her blankly. This is your residence. Eureka took Dean to a manor. He raised his hand and pointed at one of the buildings, saying, you live here. This is my manor. Her Highness Hathaway's people won't dare to break in. Thank you. Dean nodded. Eureka sighed and patted Dean's shoulder. As a friend of Her Highness Aisha, I advise you to leave her. Otherwise, you will bring disaster to her. Dean was silent for a moment and shook his head. I can't leave. Eureka was startled and frowned. Her Highness Aisha's status is too different from yours. Although she treats you as a friend, there are many things that you can't control. In this world, many people think that they can do whatever they want, but the fact is that you have to do what others want you to do. Otherwise, you can't survive. I know. Dean looked calm and said, but I can't leave anymore. What do you mean? Eureka looked sullen. Dean looked straight at him and said, you shouldn't delay the news. Now Hathaway should have known about me. If I leave at this time, she will definitely send someone to follow me, assassinate me, or capture me as a hostage. So, I can't leave anymore, understand? Eureka was startled. His face changed for a moment and finally sighed, "Go to rest." Then he turned and left. Dean looked at his back and was silent for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the pointed building. I have to find a way to leave secretly. They are right. If I stay here, I will be a burden, he thought in his heart. Although he didn't want to admit it, he had to admit that he was too weak now. When he came to the pointed building, several attendants inside had already been ordered to salute Dean. These attendants and maids were all hunters and served as servants here to serve the pioneers. Although he was a little depressed, he had to live a normal life. Dean changed and washed. After living in the wasteland for more than 40 days, his hair and body had long been smelly. After washing, he had a full meal. While thinking about the way out, he strolled in the pointed building. From the first time he entered the building, he saw that it was full of books. In the library of the outer wall, one needed to be a noble to enter the more famous libraries to borrow books. However, the books in those famous libraries were relatively limited, so he couldn't get too much valuable knowledge and information. But many of the titles of the books here were refreshing. These books should be moved from the Dragon Clan's library for pioneers to read when they were free. After all, if one lived in killing for a long time without other thoughts, it was easy to go crazy. Divine mechanics, Wing Clan's Airthorn fighting technique analysis. Dean's eyes swept through these books. Suddenly, his eyes focused on one of the books. Magic Mark Evolution Law. He raised his hand and pulled it from the bookshelf. His eyes fell on the introduction at the beginning. The evolution of magic marks is like the evolution of monsters and the evolution of magic marks warriors. The body is like a balloon, and the power is like air. When the power in the body is full, saturated, and inflated, the body will change accordingly. When the balloon explodes, it is not destruction, but the birth of another form. Chapter 579, Monster Evolution, Black Weaver? Dean was startled. Black Weaver was one of the top 10 rare monsters. The magic mark in Glenn's body was Black Weaver Magic Mark. It was good at lurking, spitting out sticky spider silk that could cross any terrain and trap the enemy. It could be controlled remotely and assassinated at close range. It could be described as a multi-directional magic mark ability. However, according to the information he had read about legendary monsters, Dreambreeder Magic Mark seemed to have only one ability, which was to paralyze the enemy's nerves through toxins and create illusions. In addition, like other legendary monsters, there was no other detailed introduction. In other words, once the magic mark evolves, the ability will be very different. Dean's eyes flashed slightly, and he continued to look down. He saw the low-level forms of other legendary monsters before evolution. Aisha's Dragon Magic Mark was actually evolved from the rare Steel Dragon Magic Mark, and the Shadow Hunter was evolved from the rare Color Dragon Magic Mark. As for his Splitter Magic Mark, it was evolved from the Bloodshed. The Bloodshed Magic Mark was just an ordinary rare monster. Its attack method was monotonous, but its destructive power was amazing, which was very similar to Splitter. The conditions for a monster's evolution are extremely harsh, and the probability is extremely low. Some monsters only have a sliver of a chance to evolve after they have grown to their complete form. But there are also monsters that mutate during their maturation or even their infancy stage, evolving into a new monster. The reason behind this is still unsolved even after many years of research. However, according to the statistics, after a monster has evolved to its complete body, the probability of evolution is 1 in 10,000. But the probability of other stages is once in hundreds of years. It's not an exaggeration to say that it's 1 in 10,000. Dean read line by line and was suddenly stunned. The probability of evolution of monsters was so low. Doesn't this mean that out of tens of thousands of Black Weavers that have grown to their complete form, only one could evolve? No wonder, even with this evolution method, Dreambreeder was still a rare legendary monster. Presumably, It was difficult for a big family like the Dragon Clan to find 100 black weavers, let alone 10,000. Thinking of this, the trace of expectation in his heart was suddenly dispelled, and he continued to read. I've interviewed the demon creature research master, Puss. According to him, after thousands of experiments, he has already found a way to increase the probability of a demon creature's evolution, and that is to feed the demon creature the divine worm powder. The more the demon creature eats, the higher the probability of evolution. However, monsters are innately afraid of the divine worm powder, making it very difficult to make it consume. He could only knock it out and force it into its stomach. After 2 years of feeding, Master Puss succeeded in making a blood drinker, ordinary named monster, evolve into a blood sender, rare named monster. Dean was slightly startled when he saw this. Worm powder? According to Master Puss, there are many ways to improve the probability of evolution of monsters. In his experiments, there are many things that can improve the probability of evolution, but the effect is weak. Dean continued to turn the pages. Soon, he saw the key point mentioned at the beginning of the book, which was to let the magic mark evolve. The probability of evolution of magic marks is lower than the probability of evolution of monsters. The factors that lead to evolution are more chaotic. Some people evolve their magic marks because of emotional excitement. Some people eat unknown plants by mistake and cause their magic marks to evolve. Master Puss once gave a hunter the worm powder, but when the hunter took the first bite, he was choked to death. After experimenting with more than 30 hunters with different magic marks, the result was the same. Master Puss could only find another way. After repeated attempts, the known way to improve the probability of evolution of magic marks is to use legendary parasitic soul worms as magic marks nutrients. In the blink of an eye, Dean saw the end of the book. When he saw the final conclusion, he suddenly had an impulse to roll his eyes. Sure enough, this was a rotten book. It was a typical title party. The beginning was amazing and made people look forward to it. Then all the way to the end, there were all kinds of analysis and speculation. But until the end, there was no analysis, and it gave an impossible conclusion. Using legendary parasitic soul worms as magic marks nutrients was not extravagant, but crazy. Moreover, from the above point of view, it was not enough to take only one legendary magic mark as nutrients, but the more the number, the greater the probability. To put it more bluntly, the more the number, the higher the probability, but it was very likely that there would be no change. Who would use the rare legendary magic marks as nutrients just because of such a sentence? Even if there was such a madman, he could not find so many legendary magic marks. Moreover, he was very doubtful that this Master Puss, who came to such a conclusion, had not personally tried to use legendary magic marks as nutrients. Reading for a long time, a waste of time. Dean had a feeling of speechlessness. He inserted the book back into the bookshelf, turned to leave, and continued to think about ways to sneak away. In the blink of an eye, 2 days passed. In the past 2 days, Dean lived in the Pointed Hat building. It was calm, and there was no movement. Hathaway, who he was worried about, seemed to have completely ignored him. She didn't come to trouble him. Moreover, he heard from Eureka that Hathaway and Aisha only met once in these 2 days and did not say anything. And according to him, when Hathaway saw Aisha, her attitude was very modest. She did not provoke her sister as sharply as before, just like a different person. Hearing Eureka's words, Dean was a bit strange. These days living in the wasteland, he lived with Aisha in the same room. When he was free, he also heard her talk about his relationship with Hathaway and the reason why she used to be modest to her sister. Could it be that Hathaway knew her thoughts and had changed now? So, she did not come to trouble him? Dean had doubts in his heart, but he didn't waste his brain to think about it. In any case, it was always right to prepare for the worst. After all, if he took a wrong step, he would lose his life. He couldn't be too optimistic about things. And according to his understanding of Hathaway, this girl did not only treat Aisha like this because of hatred and jealousy, but also because of her obsession and desire for control. Dean, Her Royal Highness wants to see you. Outside the building, Eureka's voice came. Dean was flipping the book Basic Fighting Principles in his hand. Hearing this, he came to the door and saw Eureka waving to him. He immediately walked over and asked, "Is it Aisha?" Chapter 580. Executioner. Dean was stunned. The second-ranked executioner among the legendary monsters. You also know the ranking of the legendary monsters? Eureka was surprised, and then smiled. Yes, it's this executioner. We found its traces in the wasteland, and we're sending people to search for it. If we can find its whereabouts, our dragon clan will have hope to have a super strong person with the executioner's magic mark. Dean saw his excitement and suddenly thought of something. He was a little stunned. From Aisha's mouth, he knew that the top 3 legendary monsters were very different from each other. The first one, the Dream Breeder, could fight against the remaining 7 legendary monsters at the same time, and its strength was extremely strong. Although the Executioner was not as terrible as the Dream Breeder, it could still fight against all the monsters below the top 3, and it could still maintain an undefeated position. Obviously, the Executioner was such a strong legendary monster, and ordinary pioneers could not match it at all. It was like a meal. This also meant that once it was found, he still needed Aisha's help. Thinking of this, a trace of melancholy flashed in his eyes, and he was a little worried. After all, Aisha's injury had just recovered. Although she had recovered most of her strength, it was still very dangerous to meet the Executioner. Her Highness will also go to search in person. The area she is going to is the area where the Executioner left traces, and it is very likely that she will meet the Executioner, so it is not convenient to take you with her. Eureka looked at Dean's worried expression and thought that he was thinking about his own safety, so he patted his shoulder and said, "Don't worry. Her Highness is going to let you go to the area farthest from the Executioner's traces. Also, she asked me to protect you, and there will be no danger." Dean's fingers in his sleeve slightly clenched, and he was silent for a moment and said, "I know. I'll go back and change the armor. Go quickly." Dean turned back to the building, put on the Dragon Guard armor sent by Eureka, and then filled the bag with food and carried the bow, quiver, dagger, knife, and other weapons on his back, fully armed. Maybe this is also a chance to leave. Dean thought in his heart. Aisha's lonely figure flashed in his mind, and he suddenly felt a trace of heartache. If at this time he could help her, how good would that be? However, in reality, there was no hero to save the beauty. He was not a hero either. In fact, to him, leaving this place was the best way to help her. Although his heart was aggrieved, his reason eventually prevailed. Dean took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and quickly left the building. "Let's go." Yes. The two left Eureka's manor and went straight along the street to the giant castle where Aisha lived. A moment later, the two of them arrived at the giant castle. Aisha stood next to a pillar and looked at the rows of buildings in the fortress. Hearing the wind, she turned around and saw Dean and Eureka, who were fully armed. Her emotionless eyes showed a touch of softness, but it was fleeting. She said, "You're here. Did Eureka tell you everything?" Dean looked at the girl. He had an impulse to stand side by side with her and guard her, but he restrained himself and said, "Everything." Aisha saw a trace of complex look in Dean's eyes, and a slight smile appeared on the corner of her mouth. "Don't worry, I'll be fine. You follow Eureka, and he will protect you. After I leave, the fortress is too dangerous. When I finish my business, I'll go find you." The sun was setting, and the dim yellow light shone on her cheeks from the pillar. Her hair fluttered in the breeze and twined around her cheeks. She gently swept her hand over it and pulled it to her ear. Her tone was very soft. Dean stared at her blankly. The bright red sunset reflected in his eyes like two groups of wine-red flames. He suddenly felt that this girl was very close to him, but also very far away, and he could not touch her. He was too weak, I know. He lowered his head. The sunset shone on his hair, and the shadow covered the upper half of his face. You have to be careful, not only the monsters but also the people around you. Aisha's eyes were soft, and she smiled and said, I will. At this time, there was a burst of rapid footsteps outside the giant fortress. Aisha's eyes moved slightly, and she took a deep look at Dean. She said to Eureka, "You go first." "Yes." Eureka bowed his head and responded. He didn't say a word and turned to leave. Dean glanced at Aisha and suddenly felt that this seemed to be the last time he saw her. The beautiful figure stood quietly, looking at him so softly. There seemed to be countless stars flashing in her eyes, dreamlike and extremely beautiful. He turned, and the shadow covered his cheeks. He followed behind Eureka, step by step. The air seemed to be quiet. When walking through the steps, the previous rapid footsteps came to him and then brushed past him. It was a dragon guard who came to report. The next moment, Dean followed Eureka down the steps, and along the street, they were getting farther and farther away from the silent, towering giant fortress. East gate of the fortress. Eureka and Dean were like two black lines on the street, flying straight and fast. They saw three figures standing in front of the high wall of the east gate of the fortress, 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing the armor of dragon guards, looking bored. Hearing the wind of Eureka and Dean's arrival, the 3 of them turned their heads. When they got closer and saw Eureka's face, the 3 of them were shocked. Their faces were full of astonishment, but at the same time, there was a hint of unbelievable surprise. "General Eureka." The 3 immediately saluted. Eureka and Dean stopped in front of the 3. Eureka glanced at them and nodded. "I'll lead the way to explore the number 2 Red Wasteland. Are you ready?" Reporting to General, "Everything is ready," said a young man with gray hair. His cheeks were very handsome, but there was a particularly eye-catching bone spur protruding from the back of his neck. Eureka nodded slightly and introduced him to the 3 of them. "This is our new teammate. His name is Dean. Let's go." Hearing his introduction, the 3 glanced at Dean. When they saw that Dean's face was a little too young, they couldn't help but be surprised. They were about to reach out to say hello to Dean, but after hearing Eureka's words, they had a nod to Dean to show politeness, and then followed Eureka to the open east gate. Out of the east gate, Eureka led the way. This time, the traces of the executioner appeared in the number 7 Red Wasteland, which is far away from the number 2 Red Wasteland. Eureka's voice was cold, but don't be careless. Even if we don't meet the executioner, there are other monsters, understand? Chapter 581. Whoosh, whoosh. Outside the fortress, 5 figures were flying at high speed. In the blink of an eye, the steep and towering fortress was far behind them until it disappeared completely. "Be careful, Red Wilderness number 1 is in front of us," Eureka said coldly. Dean knew that he was talking to him. After all, the other 3 knew the location of Red Wilderness number 1. He looked up and saw that the ground was covered in black soil. There was no trace of a road, and there were no buildings left. There were piles of rocks everywhere, and 2 to 3 kilometers away, there was a flag that was 4 to 5 meters tall stuck in a pile of rocks. The flag was engraved with a black dragon pattern. It fluttered over the wasteland as if it had been burned by flames. The 5 people soon came to the flag. Dean suddenly smelled the strong smell of holy worm powder in the air. This smell, with a strange fragrance, seeped into his pores. His right arm, which was crystallized under the armor, was faintly throbbing. His eyes slightly narrowed, and he secretly paid attention. Eureka didn't stop. He rushed straight past the flag and saw a huge number written on the other side of the flag. 1. It meant that this was the Red Wilderness number 1 entrance. They passed the flag one after another and continued to move forward. In the blink of an eye, they left the border marked by the flag behind. After going 7 or 8 miles into the Red Wilderness, Eureka slowed down and finally stopped. He walked forward and said, "You 3, your mission this time is to protect Dean. Understand? Protect Dean?" The 3 people were stunned and looked at Dean, who was silently following them. The gray-haired youth could not help but ask, "General, isn't our mission to find the traces of the executioner?" How could it be?" Eureka glanced at him. Find the executioner. If you really find him, can you go back alive? The gray-haired youth was stunned. This time, finding the traces of the executioner in the Red Wilderness #1 is secondary. The main thing is to protect Dean. If something happens to him, you and I won't go back alive. Understand? Eureka's eyes were cold as he glanced at the three people. The three people were stunned. Dean was shocked and could not help but look up at him. Including him? Could it be that Aisha had told him about it before he met her? He suddenly thought of something and came to his senses. He couldn't help but feel touched and ashamed. Aisha was obviously worried about his safety. She sent Eureka to protect him, but at the same time, she was worried that Eureka wouldn't be able to protect him well, so she said harsh words to him. No wonder he had a cold expression on his face along the way. So this was a reason why he was in a bad mood. General, who is Dean? The blonde woman among the three asked Eureka cautiously. The other two also looked at him in bewilderment. No matter how they guessed, they really couldn't figure out why this youth with ordinary strength was so important. Could he be the illegitimate son of the clan leader? However, they had only heard that the Saintess only had a younger sister. How could she have a son? But other than this identity, they really couldn't figure out what kind of noble identity could make a general personally protect him. And it was even more important than the general's life. Eureka glanced at the three of them and said, "You'd better not ask what you shouldn't know." The blonde woman lowered her head in embarrassment. Roar! A roar came suddenly. 5 people looked up and saw a giant walking dead nearly 5 meters high behind a pile of stones. This walking dead was similar to human beings in shape, but there was no similarity in organs in all aspects. It had dark mottled skin, white bones protruding from the chest and abdomen, exposed outside the skin, and there were several white bones under the armpits on both sides. The side bone outside the arm was very sharp. The head was huge, with a blood-colored eye on the forehead, and the neck was half a meter long. A black blood vessel-like tissue connected the neck and the head, so that the head could bend to any part freely and even rotate 360 degrees. Giant walking dead. Eureka frowned slightly, took out the dagger from the leggings, and rushed over quickly. When the three of them saw the giant walking dead, their faces turned pale, and there was a trace of horror in their eyes. Dean didn't move, standing in the same place, but his heart was secretly awe-inspiring. According to the Atlas of the Wasteland Monsters he had read from the bookshelf of the Pointed Hat Building in the past 2 days, this giant walking dead was a terrible walking dead with a hunting level as high as 58. Unlike monsters, the hunting level of the walking dead was accurate. There was no room for floating up and down, and most of the walking dead could defeat the monsters of the same level. Although the monsters were fierce, they were conscious creatures after all, but the walking dead was different, only instinct, which made its fighting style extremely desperate. Even the monsters did not dare to provoke this kind of prey easily. Whoosh! The giant walking dead and Eureka approached quickly. Eureka's body suddenly flickered, and there were 3 Eurekas in the same place. They surrounded the giant walking dead from 3 angles and then rushed up together. The giant walking dead looked ferocious, and its dark red eyes turned left and right. It suddenly raised its hand and rushed to one of Eureka's. This rush suddenly failed, and another Eureka disappeared in an instant, leaving only Eureka, who rushed to its back, jumped high, holding a dagger and stabbing it behind the cervical vertebra. This dagger was extremely sharp, and it immediately pierced into the dark red blood vessels on its neck. Black blood sprayed from inside, splashing on Eureka's armor, and a faint white gas appeared. This time it was not corrosion, but freezing. Where the blood sputtered, white frost crystals quickly appeared. Dean was secretly shocked. There were cold crystals in the head of the walking dead. The blood of the walking dead was frozen, but the blood in the giant walking dead was flowing, but it had an abnormal chill. Once it left the body, it could be frozen instantly. Eureka quickly pulled out the dagger and stepped back. The giant walking dead turned its head, and the wound pierced by the dagger quickly froze and healed. Eureka spat and looked at it coldly. Suddenly, he rushed out again. Who? A gust of wind whistled in place, and then Eureka disappeared in the sight of Dean and others. The dark red eyes of the giant walking dead moved quickly from side to side. Suddenly, its eyes moved to the edge of the left eye socket, almost bursting out of the eye socket. At this moment, a figure flashed out from its left side. It was Eureka. Puff! His dagger slashed horizontally, cutting a group of blood vessels on the neck of the giant walking dead, but it was stuck halfway. At this time, the giant walking dead's head suddenly stretched out and bit Eureka's face. Eureka snorted coldly, suddenly released the dagger, held its head with both hands, and landed on both feet. The blue veins on his arms bulged, and with a roar, he dragged its head and smashed it to the ground. Chapter 582. Surrounded by dust, Eureka's little finger quickly hooked, and the dagger on the other side of the leg quickly fell into his hand. He held it backhand and hammered it down. Puff! It penetrated into the ear of the giant walking dead. The giant walking dead trembled and stopped moving immediately. Eureka exhaled softly and pulled out the dagger. At the same time, he took out the other dagger from its neck. The two daggers rubbed against each other to remove the frozen blood on the daggers. Then he put them back into the leggings. Seeing that the giant walking dead was solved, the three young men with stone-gray hair breathed a sigh of relief and immediately stepped forward. The general is brave. The general is so powerful that he can solve a giant walking dead without using a magic weapon. When the three complimented, Dean glanced at the giant walking dead and said to Eureka, "Won't you take out the cold crystal in its head?" Hearing this, the three turned to look at him. Eureka glanced at Dean and said, "If you want to take it yourself, this thing is useless to me." Good. Dean was waiting for these words. He immediately pulled out the dagger and came to the giant walking dead's body. He stabbed along the wound caused by Eureka, trying to cut its skull first, but found that its skull was extremely hard, no less than tungsten steel, and his dagger could not pry it open a little. He was shocked in his heart. The skull was so hard. If it was him, it was almost impossible to kill this giant walking dead. Eureka saw that Dean was busy for a long time, but still couldn't cut the head of the giant walking dead. He shook his head slightly and said, "It's impossible to hurt it with your dagger." Then he pulled out the dagger tied to his leg, squatted down, and quickly slashed it, and soon the giant walking dead's head was split into several pieces. "Thank you," Dean said, and immediately opened its skull. Suddenly, a burst of white cold air came out, freezing the palm, especially the left arm. Under the stimulation of this cold air, the cold air in the arm seemed to be active, swimming toward the body. He hurriedly controlled the heartbeat and suppressed it with dragon blood technique. Soon, the active cold air was suppressed by him. At this time, the white chill in the skull of the giant walking dead gradually drifted away, revealing the brain inside, which had been completely frozen like a dark red ice ball. Dean slightly frowned and used the dagger to cut it. Fortunately, the ice ball was not as hard as its skull. It was quickly cut open, revealing an oval dark blue crystal inside. He reached out and picked it up. The crystal was so cold that his fingertips stung from the cold. He focused his gaze and saw that there was a worm-like contour in the ice crystal. "Let's go," Eureka said after Dean picked up the cold crystal. Dean's eyes lit up. He put away the cold crystal and got up to catch up. Eureka walked slowly, as if he was not in a hurry. He looked around and was alert for unknown dangers. After all, even pioneers could die in the barren area, so he had to be careful. Half an hour later, Eureka sat down on a pile of stones and said, "Let's take a break here." The three of them stopped immediately. The blonde woman immediately opened her backpack and took out a bottle of purified water from it. She trotted to Eureka and handed it to him with both hands, saying, "General, here you are." Eureka glanced at her and said indifferently, "No, I have my own." After that, he opened his backpack and took out the purified water from it. The blonde woman withdrew her hand in embarrassment, excused herself, and turned back to the other two. The three of them sat on a pile of stones next to them, taking out dry food and water to replenish their physical strength while guarding around. Dean went directly to Eureka and sat down, so that he could react in time if there was any danger. After resting for more than 10 minutes, Eureka still didn't mean to get up. Instead, he said to the blonde woman and the other two, "We will sleep here tonight. Get ready to sprinkle the Walking Dead powder." The three of them were surprised and looked at each other, but they didn't say anything. They bowed their heads and prepared the defense work of the camp according to his instructions. "It's still early now. Don't you want to walk more?" Dean looked at him in surprise. Eureka shrugged and said, "This mission is to take you out to take refuge, not to hunt monsters. There is no need to walk more. If I were not worried about being caught up by the people sent by Her Highness Hathaway, I would like to camp directly beside the flag in the wasteland." Dean was slightly stunned and thought so he didn't say anything more. Time passed quickly. In a blink of an eye, Dean and others had been in the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland for 3 days. In these 3 days, Eureka took Dean and others to wander in the outer edge of the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland. They did not go deep into the unexplored depth area to avoid encountering monsters to the greatest extent. Nevertheless, in these 3 days, they still encountered several giant walking dead, as well as some weaker sickle walking dead, and a large number of ordinary walking dead, all of which were killed by Eureka and the blonde woman. Dean never made a move from beginning to end. He was closely protected by several people, and he was happy to do so. "I didn't expect that there are so many high-level walking dead in the outer edge area that has been cleaned." Eureka frowned slightly, stabbed a dagger, killed a sickle walking dead, shook the blood on the dagger, and turned to look around. The blonde woman heard his words, turned her eyes, and said, "General, most of these high-level walking dead wandered from the deep area that has not been cleaned, right? Do you need to say that?" Eureka snorted coldly, looked up at the direction of the deep red area in the distance, and frowned slightly. A large number of walking dead wandered. Was there something in the deep area that scared them? Thinking of this, his heart was a little gloomy, and he turned and said, "Go back. It's too deep here." The blonde woman and the other two looked at each other. They were still deep here. If they retreated again, they would leave the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland. Although thinking so, the three people still obediently followed Eureka and left, sheltering Dean in the middle of the team. Soon, the crowd retreated 4 or 5 miles away. Eureka saw that they had retreated almost and stopped and said, "It's here. Get ready. We will camp here tonight." The blonde woman and the other two had no objection. They immediately circled the ground, set the alarm, and sprinkled walking dead powder. Dean sat idly on the pile of stones, glancing around in case of a monster drilling into the ground. Suddenly, he heard a faint wind in his ear. He couldn't help but look at the source of the sound, but saw that it came from a gap in a pile of stones next to him. Dean was surprised. There was wind in the pile of stones? Was there space below? Or, this is the wind of the monster breathing? There is movement. Dean immediately said to Eureka, "Under this pile of stones." Eureka, who was sitting on the pile of stones to rest, was slightly surprised. He looked in the direction of Dean's finger and listened. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound of airflow. He could not help but look at it. He pulled out the dagger beside his leg, quietly touched it, and slowly broke the stone. After a while, the pile of stones was broken, and it was dark inside. He threw a few stones into it one after another. He heard a burst of rolling sound, but there was no movement of the monster's counterattack, and the faint sound of airflow was still there. Seeing this, he was relieved, knowing that it was not the breath of the monster, but there was a ventilation below. He broke the stone and continued to walk inside. Anyway, he had come here, and it didn't matter to walk a few more steps. Besides, he was a little curious about where the ventilation below came from. Soon, the pile of stones was broken, revealing a passage, and he walked inside. Dudian immediately caught up with her. The blonde woman and the other two, who were setting up the alarm, saw the action of the two, and immediately followed, in case they stayed outside and encountered danger. The 5 people went straight down the passage under the pile of stones. The road was full of gravel, and it was easy to sprain their feet. After more than 50 meters, the gravel disappeared, and a flat road appeared in front of them. The ground was horizontal, as if it was artificially cast. Dean looked up, and suddenly his pupils shrank. He saw more than 20 meters at the end of the road. There was a huge stone door. If it were not for a gap in the middle of the stone door and the stone pattern on the stone door, he almost thought it was a rock wall. Chapter 583. The 7th District of the Red Wasteland. In the gray and turbid sky, 2 giant wings swept through the sky at a high speed. The figure inlaid in the middle of the giant wings was slender and slender, carrying a giant sword that did not match the body proportion. Every time the wings flapped, the whistling sound of the wind could be heard even on the ground hundreds of meters below. In the high speed forward, Aisha's eyes moved left and right, patrolling around. Despite the high-speed movement, the things on the ground were still presented in her vision. Dynamic vision, superimposed heating vision, coupled with high-power vision, her eyes could see every rotten hole on the gravel on the ground. Roar! Roar! Where her figure passed, there were groups of walking dead wandering on the ground. When they heard the movement above their heads, they roared up to the sky, waving their sharp arms and running in the direction of Aisha's flying. Until her figure was lost in the field of vision, they slowly returned to the wandering state. Well, suddenly, Aisha's eyes narrowed and fell on one of the messy gravel. There were 2 huge footprints on the ground here, and there was a long dent behind the footprints, as if it had been crushed by a giant python. Found it! Aisha's eyes lit up, and she looked forward along the footprints, only to see the footprints spread forward along the gravel to the distance. She immediately flew behind the footprints and chased at a high speed. 10 minutes later, Aisha, who was flying at full speed, suddenly stopped in the air. Her calm face was full of shock, and she looked at a place in front of her in horror. The ground was messy. There were huge craters in the shape of meteorites everywhere, and countless walking dead were lying in the huge craters. The types of these walking dead were strange. They were the most common walking dead, and there were sickle walking dead, one-horned walking dead, giant walking dead, and other high-level walking dead. At this moment, all the bodies were broken, and the heads were almost all destroyed. Only a few walking dead bodies were cut at the waist, and the upper body was still crawling in the pile of corpses, making a clicking sound. However, Aisha's trembling eyes fell on one of the huge craters. There was a huge corpse, or rather, a skeleton, lying there quietly. The flesh on the surface of the corpse had been eaten up, revealing the huge skeleton. At this moment, there were still 7 or 8 walking dead that were cut at the waist, desperately gnawing the remaining flesh. This corpse was an extremely large monster. Just the length of the skeleton from the head to the soles of the feet was about 12 to 13 meters. There was also a 10-meter-long tail that had been gnawed and torn. Its skeleton was extremely ferocious. Other than the spine in the middle, which was extremely thick and strong, the ribs and scaffolding that extended from the spine to the sides were also extremely strong and extended to the left and right. It could be seen that the width of its body was at least 7 or 8 meters. How? Aisha stared at the skeleton. Her heart was shocked. Wasn't this the executioner she was looking for? He was actually dead. She couldn't accept this fact. The executioner's head-on combat ability was not as weak as the Shadow Hunter. Judging from its size, this executioner had obviously reached the mature stage. This was a legendary monster, second only to the Dream Breeder, and it was much stronger than her magic-marked demonic dragon. How could it die here? She was stunned for a long time. Suddenly, her eyes noticed a few corpses gnawing on the executioner's body. She was stunned for a moment. The next moment, her eyes swept around again, looking at the dead corpses all over the place. her pupils slightly shrank. Is it whoosh, whoosh, whoosh? At this moment, 3 huge dragon wings similar to Aisha's came at an extremely fast speed, but their dragon wings were covered with a layer of dark red blood film. They were pure flesh wings, while the back of Aisha's dragon wings were covered with blood-red feathers. Sister, the leading figure, made a surprised voice. Hearing this voice, Aisha's contracted pupils suddenly recovered slowly. She put away the shock on her face. She didn't look back, but silently looked at the executioner's body on the ground, showing a thoughtful look. Hathaway took the lead and stopped beside Aisha. She glanced forward and immediately took the purgatory scene below into her eyes. When she saw the giant monster skeleton, she suddenly stared slightly and was shocked. Your Highness, Aisha has seen you. Your Highness, Aisha has seen you. The 2 people behind Hathaway hurried and immediately saluted Aisha. Then they looked at the place where the 2 people were looking at and suddenly showed a shocked look. Isn't this the executioner? One of them was shocked and said, How could it die here? What happened here? The shock on Hathaway's face had calmed down, and her brows were wrinkled. Both her appearance and the current demeanor were somewhat similar to Aisha's. She showed a thoughtful look and said, There are so many walking dead bodies around, and there are even high-level walking dead like the giant walking dead. Could it be there's a corpse king here? Corpse king? The white-skinned young man who spoke before glared and said, Is it difficult? Is it possible that this executioner was eaten by the corpse king? Another middle-aged man with a protruding bone spur on his arm looked ugly and said, If it's the corpse king, it's a big trouble. If it's not the corpse king, it's another monster. Hathaway's eyes flickered slightly and whispered, Other monsters hurt the executioner, and then it met this small group of corpses and was killed. Whiz. When the 3 people communicated, Aisha's figure suddenly descended and landed a few meters above the executioner's body. Several walking dead who were gnawing on the corpse saw Aisha and immediately looked up and roared, reaching for her boots. She held the giant sword on her back, and the bandage was automatically untied. Suddenly, the blood flashed, and the bodies of several walking dead suddenly froze. The next moment, the head slowly slipped from the bridge of the nose, and the cut surface was neat. Hathaway and the other 2 also followed at this moment. Its parasitic soul worm seems to be gone. The previous middle-aged man looked at the corpse and saw that its internal organs had been completely gnawed, and there would be no parasitic soul worm left. Hearing his words, Hathaway bit her teeth slightly and clenched her fingers, but soon loosened and said to Aisha, Sister, it seems that in the wasteland of our dragon clan, there is a terrible monster. We have to find it out as soon as possible. Otherwise, other pioneers who are performing tasks outside will fall into the hands of monsters at any time. Aisha didn't hear her words, looked at the corpse for a moment, and slowly said, It was killed by the corpse king. This should be a formed corpse king, carrying the corpse tied. Luca, you go back immediately and pass down the order. There's a corpse king. Once you see the corpse tied, retreat immediately. Chapter 584. This is a relic. Hearing Eureka's words, the blonde woman and the other 2 were stunned. Dean was slightly startled. He couldn't help but look at the door carefully, and soon noticed a raised stone beside the door. Be careful, Eureka said with a dignified expression. There are many kinds of relics. Some have treasures left from the old era, and some are traps with destructive light that can penetrate everything. Destructive light? Dean's heart moved. Was it a laser? He immediately stopped the idea of going forward to explore. If there were really laser weapons in the relics, according to Eureka, it seemed that the energy of the laser weapons was not exhausted, indicating that there was also a solar energy system installed in the relics. However, if Eureka had seen laser weapons, did it mean that the people inside the giant wall also mastered laser weapons? Destructive light? Is it a weapon? Dean asked Eureka on purpose. The blonde woman and the other 2 also looked at Eureka curiously. Almost, it should be a kind of weapon from the old era. Eureka said in a deep voice. Even the pioneers can't avoid it. It's very dangerous. No way. The people of the old era are so strong. Weren't they exterminated? If there is such a strong power, how could they be exterminated? The blonde woman and the other two were surprised. Dean's eyes narrowed slightly, and he asked Eureka, since this weapon is so strong, why didn't you bring it back to the giant wall? Why haven't I heard of it? Eureka shook his head slightly. It's useless to dismantle it. After all, it's an old weapon. We don't know how to use it. I see. Dean was a little relieved. If the people inside the giant wall mastered the laser weapons of the old era, it would be really tricky. Even his new magic couldn't resist it. However, judging from the current situation, the people inside the giant wall should not have such power as laser weapons. Otherwise, it would be enough to deter all the pioneers and command all the pioneers. Obviously, the forces in the inner wall were complicated and not twisted into a rope, which meant that the forces in the inner wall were not loyal to the same person. Step back a little. Eureka stared at the giant stone door for a moment, and suddenly his eyes moved, and he said in a deep voice. Dean and others immediately retreated. Eureka pulled out a dark spear from his back. The body of the spear was engraved with many inscriptions, which looked extremely simple. At this moment, these inscriptions seemed to be the color of burning blood. The body of the spear gradually changed, especially from the hilt that Eureka held in his hand. It gradually dissolved. The spear shaft that had dissolved into a viscous liquid spread along his palm and wrapped around his body like a living liquid. Dean's pupils shrank. Was this a magic weapon? Was this really just a genetic weapon? A moment later, Eureka's whole body was wrapped in the dark red liquid. Sharp thorns and scales protruded from all parts of his body. Behind the armor, the mucus converged and extended to form a tail more than 3 meters long. His body also changed accordingly, and there was a faint cracking sound of bones protruding from his body. His figure also became much taller. The change ended quickly. In the blink of an eye, the handsome Eureka with a scholarly temperament was gone. Instead, a monster with black skin, scales, a black tail, and a head like a lion appeared in front of Dean and others. Dean felt a strong sense of oppression, and there was a shivering feeling of shrinking pores. Intuition told him that the person in front of him was not Eureka, but a real monster. Step back a little more, the monster said to Dean and others in a hoarse voice. Hearing his voice, Dean's eyes flashed, and he stepped back 7 or 8 meters. After Dean and the others were far away, Eureka took a step forward. A spike protruded from his black arm, which was as thick as an orangutan's. It was 1/2 meter long, and the tip looked like a spear. His figure suddenly flashed, and he slammed into the giant door on the stone wall. The spear-like black spike suddenly stabbed into the gap of the door. Bang! There was a huge shock. The lime sand on the rock wall above everyone's head fell, and a large amount of dust fluttered on the giant stone door. Eureka looked at the front of the black spike, but did not pierce into the gap of the door. His heart was moved, and he stepped back a few steps. He waved the black spike on the giant stone door, and soon a dent was made, and stone chips were flying. After a moment, the dust dispersed. Dean and others suddenly saw that under the black spike on Eureka's arm, lines appeared on the giant stone door. The lines revealed a dark gold color, which seemed to be some kind of metal. Dean was startled and suddenly realized that this was not a stone door, but a metal door. It was just that the accumulation of dust over the years formed a stone shell on the door. If it's a modern metal gate from the old era, then Dean's eyes fell on a raised stone next to the gate. He immediately said to Eureka, "General, cut the stone chips there and let's see." Eureka turned his head and glanced at Dean. His dark green eyes flashed slightly. He glanced at the raised stone and jumped over. His arms waved quickly, and the stone chips splashed. Soon, the stone chips on the raised stone were all removed, and the shape inside was revealed. It was a metal instrument. Dean saw this metal instrument, and his eyes suddenly lit up. This should be the password lock to open the door. Eureka stopped and looked at the metal instrument. Dean waited for a moment, and seeing that no mechanism was triggered, he immediately walked over. Seeing this, the blonde woman and the others also followed. Dean reached out to touch the metal instrument. Eureka hurriedly said, "Be careful." Dean glanced at him. Seeing that he did not notice any mechanism, he secretly thought that he was making a fuss. He raised his finger and opened the metal shell on the surface of the metal instrument. Suddenly, he was stunned. There was a screen inside, and there was no password button. Could it be that this was an iris scan? Eureka was startled by Dean's action. He looked around vigilantly. Seeing that no mechanism was triggered, he was a little relieved. When he was about to blame Dean, he saw Dean's finger press a button-like thing in the metal box. Damn it! Eureka was furious. Before he could reprimand Dean, a red light suddenly shot out from the metal box and swept toward them. Not good. Eureka was shocked, but after all, he was a pioneer. He reacted very quickly. He hurriedly raised his hand to cover his face and retreated. At this critical moment, he instinctively retreated to save his life. After retreating 4 or 5 meters, he remembered to protect Dean's life. When he raised his head and was about to grab Dean, he saw that the red light had disappeared. Dean and the other 3 who were standing in front of the metal box could not react in time. They only had time to protect their heads in a hurry. There were no wounds on their bodies. When Dean saw the light from the dialysis machine, he confirmed that it was an iris scan. He couldn't help but be disappointed. If it was an iris scan, then only the person who entered his iris into the machine could open the door. Scan completed. Identity confirmed. Shelter opened. Chapter 585. Open. Dean was stunned. Eureka, who reacted later, heard the mechanical voice and was shocked. He pulled Dean's body back a few steps. He looked at the metal instrument vigilantly and shouted, "Who are you? Come out." Hearing his words, the blonde woman and the other 2 were shocked and hurriedly stepped back. They pulled out their weapons and looked at the metal instrument nervously. They didn't expect that there was a person hiding inside, but they couldn't see any clues at all. It was terrible. A person. Dean was stunned for a moment and quickly reacted. He felt funny in his heart and relieved at the same time. It seemed that these people didn't understand English and didn't understand the previous words. This was good, so they wouldn't be suspicious of him. Buzz. At this moment, the ground under everyone's feet suddenly shook, and the dust on the surrounding walls rustled down. No, it's an earthquake. Eureka's face changed slightly and hurriedly said, "It's going to collapse soon. Leave." Before he finished speaking, he suddenly stopped and looked at the stone door in front of him, stunned. Rumble. The gap in the middle of the stone door slowly split open. In the trembling sound of the ground, it gradually opened to both sides. Thick dust rolled out from under the stone door and rushed toward everyone, making them dusty. Who? Suddenly, like a sigh of the wind, came out of the stone door. Soon, the stone door disappeared completely and retracted into the walls on both sides. A lot of rubbed stone chips fell from the walls. In the thick fog of dust, the few of them raised their hands to cover their faces. Squinting their eyes, they peered inside, only to see that the stone door was pitch black, without the slightest bit of light. It was as if a dark, bloody mouth was waiting for them to enter. Eureka, the blonde woman, and others were secretly shocked and didn't dare to move. When Dean saw the open giant door, he was completely shocked. It was really open, not to mention the fact that there was still energy here. Just the opening of this door was too strange. Could it be that the previous scan was not an iris scan? However, he was in his father's research institute since he was a child. He was familiar with iris scanning and fingerprint scanning. The previous scan was clearly an iris scan. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but glance at Eureka, the blonde woman, and the others next to him. He saw that they were nervous and vigilant, and their muscles were tense, as if they were ready to fight with the previous person at any time. This expression did not seem to be fake. He recalled the scene of the previous iris scan. Eureka retreated immediately, and the blonde woman and the other 2 bowed their heads to protect their heads. It seemed that, only he was scanned. In other words, it is the first time for them to come here. The door was opened because it scanned me? Dean was at a loss. Was it related to him? However, he had never been here before. Even before he went into hibernation, he didn't remember that there would be such a thing buried underground. According to the electronic voice from before, this place seemed to be called the Shelter. Could it be a place built by the people of the olden era to avoid disaster? When he was puzzled, the thick fog-like dust gradually settled, revealing the scene inside the stone door. Although it was dark, Dean's dark vision could see without hindrance that there were dozens of human skeletons lying on the ground beside the door. The skeletons seemed to have decayed long ago, wrapped in old human clothes. Surprisingly, these clothes were relatively intact and had not been eroded too seriously by time. And the styles of the clothes were various, including dresses, jeans and shirts, long-sleeve shirts, and so on. Dean was stunned. These clothes were the most common clothes of the olden era. Could it be that the skeletons on the ground were ordinary people of the olden era? Light the fire. Eureka's voice sounded. The middle-aged man in the blonde woman's group took out a torch from his backpack, poured kerosene on it, and lit it. The faint fire suddenly dispelled the darkness in front of them. The skeletons all over the ground were reflected in their sight, and their faces changed slightly. Eureka's eyes flickered slightly. He glanced at the metal instrument beside the stone door and thought that this should be the device to open the ruins. He turned his head and glanced at Dean, frowning slightly. Did this kid accidentally touch it, or did he already know the use of this device? I didn't expect that this is the thing to open the ruins. Brother Eureka, what kind of ruins do you think it is? Are there any treasures in it? Dean saw Eureka's eyes and immediately showed curiosity and asked him. Hearing Dean's words, Eureka's eyes flickered and the doubts in his heart were suddenly dispelled. He thought that even if this kid had a good relationship with Her Highness Aisha, he might not know about the ruins. After all, this was the product of the olden era more than 300 years ago. Even Her Highness Aisha was not clear about it, let alone him. It's not clear yet. Eureka took back his eyes and looked at the dark ruins. He said to the middle-aged man holding the torch, "You, go ahead and lead the way." The middle-aged man's face changed, and he hurriedly said, "General, I'm not good at defense, I just do as I say." Eureka scolded, and then his tone slowed down a little, and he said indifferently, "In my opinion, this should be a treasure ruins. If there are traps in the dangerous ruins, we will be attacked when the door is opened." The middle-aged man was slightly startled, and he couldn't help but feel moved. But after all, he was a veteran hunter, so he quickly suppressed his greed and thought, "In your opinion, how can my life be used as a scapegoat for you, just because of your guess?" "General, my perception is relatively weak. If I go ahead and encounter any danger, I'm afraid I won't be able to perceive it in advance. I'm afraid it will harm everyone." The middle-aged man tried to persuade from a different perspective. When Eureka heard his words, how could he not know what he was thinking? He snorted and said, "I said, there is no danger in here. If you talk more, I'll throw you in directly." The middle-aged man's face was ugly. He knew that things couldn't be changed. He secretly gritted his teeth, held the torch high, and slowly stepped into the ruins. Every step he took made him feel like stepping into a death swamp, and he would fall at any time. Crack, crack. His boots broke the corpses on the ground. The corpses that had lost water were extremely fragile and broke with one step. Dean silently followed in the middle of the team, keeping a distance from Eureka. Although Eureka's attitude towards him had always been relatively peaceful, and he had the task of protecting him, when the real danger came, it was hard to guarantee that Eureka would not grab him and use him as a scapegoat. To survive outside the wall, every step had to rely on wisdom. Soon, all of them entered the ruins. The middle-aged man stepped out of the pile of corpses at the door and slowly went deeper into the darkness in front of the torch. Dean glanced around the ruins with his night vision. He found that the inside of the ruins was an extremely spacious circular hall. Corpses could be seen everywhere on the ground. All of them were wearing the clothes of ordinary people from the old era. In addition to the dozens of skeletons at the entrance, there were even more scattered corpses everywhere in the circular hall. In some corners, there were even hundreds of skeletons piled up like a mountain of corpses. The densely packed skeletons were wrapped in the clothes of the old era, quietly lying there, their empty eye sockets filled with loneliness. Seeing these corpses wearing the clothes of the old era, Dean had an indescribable feeling in his heart, like sadness, but also like loneliness. The memories of the old era hidden in the depths of his mind slowly emerged in front of him. However, perhaps it was too long, so that he suddenly felt that what emerged in his mind was only a somewhat vague, steel jungle city, and the faces of his father, mother, and sister. In addition, he felt that the impression of other things was a little vague. Had it been so long that it had been forgotten? These corpses, are they the people of the old era? How can there be so many? The blonde woman looked at the corpses around her, among which there were some broken hands and half bones scattered on the ground. It was the first time for her to see a group of corpses from the old era, and she had a strong sense of shock. The bodies of these people from the old era seemed to be very fragile. The young man on the other side said. He did not avoid stepping on the ribs on the chest of a skeleton, did not choose other footholds, and did not care about the objects under his feet. Even if they had been dead for 300 years, the bones are too powder. I heard that people like us, some of whom have special abilities, have been dead for hundreds of years, and their bones are still as hard as steel. These corpses are at most rubbed with flour. In any era, there are weak and strong, and these should be the weak. Eureka said indifferently. He turned his head and looked around, frowning. It was too quiet here, so quiet that there was no sound. Could it be that there were no living things in it at all? Dean heard the words of these people and took a look at the corpses piled up around him. He was basically sure that this was just a shelter built before the disaster broke out. This could also be seen from the corpses on the ground. Most of these corpses were women and children. It was not a valuable sealed place to hide old technological weapons. He was a little disappointed in his heart, but not too regretful. After all, if there were really high-tech items from the old era, with Eureka, they would eventually have to be handed over to the Dragon Clan. If it fell into the hands of the inner wall, it would become a hindrance to his future. It seems that there was a fight here. There are a lot of broken limbs and corpses. The blonde woman said. Dean frowned slightly. He had already noticed this, and then associated it with the environment here. Obviously, these people were the lucky ones selected by the army and sent to this shelter. Most of the fights here were because of food. Could it be that the door can't be opened from inside? Dean looked back at both sides of the door, but did not see the iris scanner. He could not help but frown. If the door couldn't be opened from the inside, causing them to have to compete for food here, that is to say, the people who sent these survivors here were probably planning to wait for the disaster to end, and then they would open it from the outside. The only use of this approach was to avoid some people inside from opening the shelter because of their own reasons and sacrificing everyone. Soon, the middle-aged man went deep into the center of the circular hall with a torch. At this time, Dean passed by a pile of corpses. Because of the angle, he suddenly saw the outline of a door under the gap of the pile of corpses leaning against the wall. From the height, it seemed to be about 3 meters. His gaze focused, and very quickly, he quietly turned his gaze to look around. But with the help of his opened-up vision, he used his peripheral vision to carefully look at the pile of corpses. Very quickly, he discovered that it was not an illusion. There was indeed a door hidden under the pile of corpses. His heart was slightly moved, but he did not tell Eureka and others. On the contrary, he planned to wait for the next time to sneak in and check it out. Anyway, with the size of the ruins, Eureka and others could not move it away. Although he did not know what was in the door, since it was the secret he found, of course, he would not easily share it with others. If there was a treasure hidden inside, it would bring him a fatal disaster. There's a black shadow over there. What is it? Dean immediately pointed to another place and said. Hearing Dean's words, Eureka and the others were shocked and a little nervous, especially the middle-aged man who was leading the way holding the torch. He swallowed his saliva and shone the torch at the place where Dean was pointing. He slowly approached it, only to find that it was just a pile of corpses. He breathed a sigh of relief and then became a little annoyed. However, thinking of Dean's unknown identity, he resisted the urge to scold him. This place is very big. For now, there should be no danger. Light it up first, Eureka said. Hearing this, Dean thought it was not good. Once it was illuminated, they were likely to find the door. When the blonde woman heard the words, she immediately turned out their own torches and kerosene, ignited them, and inserted them in the surrounding corpses. Several torches and kerosene lamps were lit in the darkness, and the outline of the circular hall was immediately illuminated. It's going to be discovered. Dean saw that the blonde woman and the other two were still lighting new oil dishes. He knew that the door would be exposed sooner or later. He sighed in his heart. It seemed that it was not his own opportunity. He didn't force it. After all, it was inevitable. Kaka! Suddenly, outside the gate of the ruins behind them, there were several footsteps, and there was the sound of stones being kicked away and rolling. Everyone was shocked and looked back in an instant. This look, Dean's face suddenly changed. He saw 3 huge figures coming from the entrance of the ruins. They were 3 giant walking dead. No, it's the giant walking dead. He hurriedly cried. Eureka heard Dean's words, and his heart moved. This kid's perception was so strong. This idea flashed, and soon he also saw the 3 giant walking dead that were shaking and gradually accelerating. He was shocked. How could there be 3 giant walking dead here? Could it be that it had followed their scent? Damn it! Eureka bit his teeth slightly and said, "You step back." With that, he bent his body slightly and jumped out. Is it the giant walking dead? The blonde woman hurriedly retreated in fear. This was not a monster they could fight. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.